Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. The crisp Wyoming air bit at my face as I stepped out of my truck at the Bighorn National Forest Ranger Station. It was October 1977. And after 4 months on the job, I still couldn't believe this was my life now. The vast wilderness stretched before me, a patchwork of deep greens and golds as autumn took hold of the landscape. My name is George Williams, and this is the story of how my dream job became a nightmare. I'd grown up in Chicago, where the closest thing to wildlife was the occasional raccoon digging through garbage bins. The constant symphony of car horns and elevated trains had been my lullaby for 28 years. But something had always called me to the wilderness, a yearning I couldn't explain. When I saw the job posting for a park ranger position in Wyoming, I didn't hesitate. The other rangers had welcomed me warmly enough, though I could tell they were waiting to see if I'd make it through my first winter. Kevin Harrow, a veteran ranger with 15 years under his belt, had taken me under his wing. He was the kind of man who seemed to know every tree in the forest by name, every animal track by sight, and every weather pattern by heart. "Morning, George," Kevin called out as I entered the station. He was hunched over a map, his coffee leaving rings on the worn wooden desk. "Got some reports of illegal hunting up near Crazy Woman Canyon. Mind checking it out?" I nodded, grateful for the assignment. The canyon had become one of my favorite spots in the forest, despite its peculiar name. "Any particular areas I should focus on?" Kevin traced a path with his finger along the map. "There's been activity around these old campsites here and here, probably just some yahoos thinking they can get away with hunting out of season, but better safe than sorry." I gathered my gear methodically: radio, first aid kit, binoculars, and my standard issue rifle. The weapon felt heavy against my shoulder, a constant reminder of the responsibility that came with the badge. In 4 months, I'd never had to use it for anything more threatening than warning shots to scare off aggressive wildlife. The drive to Crazy Woman Canyon took about an hour, the dirt road winding through increasingly remote territory. The radio crackled occasionally with updates from other rangers, their voices providing a tenuous link to civilization. As I drove deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to press in closer, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the morning light into ghostly patterns on the ground. I parked at the trailhead and began my patrol on foot. The air was unusually still that morning, the typical chorus of birdsong notably absent. My boots crunched on fallen leaves, the sound seemingly amplified in the unnatural quiet. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. The first campsite showed signs of recent use, a fire pit with warm ashes, empty beer cans, and food wrappers scattered about. I documented the scene with my camera and collected the trash, making mental notes for my report. It wasn't until I reached the second site that things took a turn I never could have anticipated. The stillness was broken by a rustling in the underbrush. I turned, expecting to see a deer or perhaps a black bear, common enough sights in these parts. What I saw instead would haunt my dreams for years to come. He stood at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the shadows of the pine trees. At first glance, he appeared to be just a man, tall and gaunt, but something about him was fundamentally wrong. His skin had an almost translucent quality, like paper held up to light, and his eyes— God, his eyes were too large, too dark, seeming to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. My training kicked in automatically. "Sir, this is a restricted area. I need to see your camping permit." My voice sounded hollow in the still air. He didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with those impossible eyes. His clothes hung in tatters from his frame, not the typical gear of a hiker or hunter. They looked ancient, as if he'd been wearing them for decades. I took a step closer, my hand instinctively moving to my rifle. "Sir, I need you to respond. Are you all right?" The movement was so fast I almost missed it. One moment he was standing at the edge of the clearing, the next he was directly in front of me, his cold hand gripping my rifle. The speed was inhuman, impossible. His touch sent waves of ice through my body, a bone-deep cold that seemed to freeze my very thoughts. We struggled for the weapon, but his strength was overwhelming. Up close I could see that his skin wasn't just pale, it had a gray, mottled quality that made my stomach turn. His breath, when it hit my face, carried the musty sweetness of decay. Through sheer desperation, I managed to wrench the rifle free and stumble backward. My heart hammered against my ribs as I raised the weapon. "Stay back!" I shouted, my finger trembling on the trigger. He tilted his head slightly, the movement jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Then his mouth opened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. No sound came out. I ran. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I followed procedure, that I handled the situation with the professionalism my badge demanded. But in that moment, facing something that shouldn't exist, all my training evaporated. I ran back to my truck, falling twice in my panic, the sound of my own ragged breathing drowning out everything else. Only when I was inside the vehicle, doors locked and engine running, did I reach for my radio with trembling hands. "Base, this is Williams. I've got a situation at Campsite B in Crazy Woman Canyon. Need backup immediately." Kevin's voice crackled back, concern evident even through the static. "What kind of situation, George? Over." I hesitated. How could I describe what I'd seen without sounding crazy? "Possible hostile individual. Attempted to grab my weapon. Request immediate assistance." "Copy that. Stay put. We're sending help." I kept my eyes on the trees, scanning for any movement. The man, if that's what he was, had vanished as quickly as he'd appeared. By the time backup arrived 20 minutes later, there was no trace of him. No footprints in the soft earth, no broken branches marking his passage. Nothing to prove he'd ever been there at all. The following days blurred together in a haze of questioning and paperwork. My fellow rangers searched the area thoroughly, but found nothing. No tracks, no traces, no evidence that anyone had been there besides me. I could see the doubt in their eyes, the way they exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking. "Look, George," Kevin said one evening as we sat in the station after hours. "I've been doing this job for 15 years. Sometimes the forest, it plays tricks on your mind. The isolation, the silence, it can get to you." I stared into my coffee, now cold and bitter. "I know what I saw, Kevin. This wasn't some trick of the light or my imagination running wild. He was real. Whatever he was real." Kevin leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "Maybe it was a homeless guy. We get them sometimes living off the grid in the deeper parts of the forest. They can look pretty rough after a while." But I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, that impossible speed, the otherworldly wrongness of his movements. No homeless person could move like that. No person could. The other rangers started treating me differently. They paired me up more often, claimed it was for safety, but I knew they were worried about me. I heard whispers about stress leave, about how the job wasn't for everyone. I started doubting myself, questioning my memories. Maybe they were right. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Then the dreams started. Every night I'd see him standing at the foot of my bed, those black eyes boring into mine. I'd wake up gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the room temperature seemingly dropped by 20 degrees. Sometimes I'd find my windows open, though I was sure I'd locked them before going to bed. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything, the dreams, the temperature drops, the strange sounds I'd hear at night. I needed proof, something concrete to show I wasn't losing my mind. It was Kevin who found it first. A crisp morning in late October, the kind where frost crunches under your boots and your breath hangs in the air like smoke. The radio crackled to life just as I was finishing my morning patrol. "George?" Kevin's voice was tight, controlled. "I need you to come to the old Miller campsite, now." I knew from his tone that something was wrong. The drive seemed to take forever, though it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. When I arrived, I found Kevin standing at the edge of the clearing, his face ash-gray. The body lay scattered across the campsite like pieces of a grotesque puzzle. The victim had been torn apart with impossible strength, limbs wrenched from their sockets, flesh shredded by something sharper than any animal's claws. The ground was saturated with blood, yet there were no tracks, no signs of struggle. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, fighting down the bile rising in my throat. Kevin radioed it in while I secured the perimeter. As we waited for the authorities, I saw something that made my blood freeze. There, at the edge of the trees, a familiar figure watching us with those bottomless black eyes. "Kevin," I grabbed his arm, pointing, but by the time he turned, the figure was gone. The victim was identified as James Morrison, a local hunter who'd been reported missing a week earlier. The official investigation pointed to an animal attack, possibly a grizzly, though no one could explain the lack of tracks or the peculiar way the body had been dismembered. I knew better. The pattern of destruction, the surgical precision of some of the cuts. This was no animal attack. This was something else entirely. The sightings increased after that. I'd catch glimpses of him everywhere, between the trees during patrols, in the reflection of my truck's windows, standing in the shadows of the station at dusk. Each time he'd vanish the moment someone else looked. My colleagues' concern turned to worry, then to fear. They saw the dark circles under my eyes, the way I jumped at shadows, how I'd stopped eating in the break room, preferring to keep my back to a wall and my eyes on the windows. I started carrying my rifle everywhere, even off-duty. I installed extra locks on my doors and windows, bought security cameras for my small cabin. The footage would often glitch around 3 a.m., showing static for exactly 7 minutes before returning to normal. One night, reviewing the footage, I saw him, standing perfectly still in my yard for hours, head tilted at an impossible angle, staring directly into the camera. When I ran outside with my rifle, he was gone, but the grass where he'd stood was frozen solid despite the warm summer night. I tried to find patterns, some logic to his appearances. I pored over local history books, searching for similar stories. In the deepest archives of the local library, I found mentions of similar sightings dating back to the 1800s. Stories of a tall, pale figure seen before disappearances, of hunters found torn apart, of children who vanished into the woods never to return. The more I discovered, the more he appeared. It was as if my knowledge of him somehow drew him closer, made him stronger. It ended where it began, in a way. I was home, trying to lose myself in mindless television when the power went out. The temperature dropped suddenly, my breath visible in the darkness. I knew he was coming. I grabbed my rifle and waited. The security cameras had gone dead, but I didn't need them. I could feel his presence, like a weight pressing against my skull. When I saw him standing in my yard, I didn't hesitate. I went outside to face him, knowing this had to end one way or another. "What do you want?" I shouted into the darkness. "Why are you doing this?" He moved then, faster than ever before, closing the distance between us in an eye blink. His hand closed around my throat, cold as the grave, strong as steel. Up close, his face was even more horrible than I remembered. Not just pale, but somehow wrong, as if someone had tried to craft a human face without ever having seen one. I struggled against his grip, feeling my consciousness fading. This was it, I thought. I was going to end up like Morrison, another mysterious death in the forest. The gunshot rang out like thunder. The creature's grip loosened as it staggered backward, black liquid seeping from a wound in its chest. I fell to my knees, gasping for air. Kevin stood at the edge of my property, his rifle still raised. "I've been following you," he admitted as he helped me up. "I knew something was wrong, really wrong. I just didn't know what until now." We both watched as the creature retreated into the darkness, leaving a trail of black fluid that seemed to evaporate as it hit the ground. It never made a sound. I left the Ranger Service the next week. Kevin tried to convince me to stay, said we could face this thing together, but I'd had enough. I moved to Arizona, where the desert's stark openness felt safer than the close darkness of the forest. The official report listed the Morrison case as an unsolved animal attack. My encounter was explained away as stress-induced paranoia. Kevin never told anyone what he saw that night, though he sends me updates every few months, keeping me informed of any unusual incidents in the forest. Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls just right, I think I see a tall, pale figure standing in the distance. But I've learned to look away, to not acknowledge it. Perhaps that's why I survived when others didn't. I learned when to stop looking, when to walk away. The Bighorn National Forest still stands, beautiful and mysterious as ever. Tourists still camp there, hikers still wander its trails, and rangers still patrol its vast expanses. But if you go there, and if you see something strange in the shadows, something that moves too fast or stands too still, don't look too long. Don't try to understand it. Just walk away. because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some watchers should remain in the woods. The manila folder landed on my desk with a dull thud. Inside were photos of mangled livestock, missing person reports, and grainy trail camera footage that showed only shadows. Another assignment, another horror waiting in the wilderness. But this one would be different. This one would be my last. My name is Robert Johnson, and for 15 years I worked for a classified government unit that investigates unexplained phenomena. We operate in the shadows, cleaning up messes that would shatter the public's perception of reality. Most of our work involves debunking hoaxes or explaining away natural phenomena, but sometimes we find something that defies explanation, something that shouldn't exist. The briefing was held in a windowless room deep within a nondescript government building in Washington, D.C. Deputy Director Morrison, a tall woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much, laid out the situation. Pine Hollow, Maine, population 847. In the past 6 months, 3 hikers have vanished without a trace. 7 cattle mutilations. 2 search and rescue teams reported hearing unusual sounds before their equipment malfunctioned. She paused, letting the information sink in. Local authorities are overwhelmed. The mayor is talking to reporters. We need this contained before it draws national attention. I studied the photos spread across the table. The cattle hadn't been eaten. They'd been torn apart, as if by something testing its strength. The missing hikers were experienced outdoorsmen, not amateur tourists who might have gotten lost. Something was wrong in Pine Hollow, and we were being sent to fix it. Our 4-person team assembled at Bangor International Airport on a humid August afternoon. I'd worked with each of them before, trusted them with my life. Eric Barnes, our technology specialist, was already setting up his equipment in the back of our unmarked SUV. His fingers moved across keyboards with practiced precision, but I noticed they trembled slightly. He'd lost his partner on our last mission in the Ozarks. Lisa Murray, our biologist, was examining satellite maps of the area. Her academic background gave her an air of detachment, but I'd seen her face down things that would send most people running in terror. She'd specialized in predator behavior before joining the unit, though nothing in her studies had prepared her for what we actually hunted. Sam Torres completed our team. Former Marine Force Recon, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen combat, but didn't feel the need to talk about it. He methodically checked our weapons' standard-issue M4 carbines and Sig Sauer sidearms. We never knew what we might encounter, so we came prepared for anything. The drive north took us through increasingly remote territory. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then dirt. Cell service disappeared. The GPS showed only empty spaces between the trees. Pine Hollow wasn't just off the beaten path, it was barely on the map. The town itself was a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single main street. A few pickup trucks were parked outside the general store, their rust patterns suggesting they'd been there for years. An American flag hung limply from the post office, its colors faded by sun and rain. We checked into the Pine Hollow Inn, a 2-story building that had seen better days. The owner, Mrs. Henderson, was a widow in her 70s, who seemed relieved to have paying customers. "Not many tourists these days," she said, her voice carrying a hint of worry. "Not since the disappearances started." I asked her about the missing hikers. Her face tightened. Good people. Knew these woods better than anyone. Whatever took them. She stopped herself, shaking her head. "You be careful out there. The forest, it's different now." We spent the first day interviewing locals and examining the sites where the cattle had been found. The pattern was clear. All the incidents had occurred within a 5-mile radius of an area the locals called the dead zone, where even the hardiest hunters refused to go. Eric's equipment picked up unusual electromagnetic readings. "It's like something's interfering with the natural magnetic field," he said, frowning at his instruments. "I've never seen patterns like this before." Lisa found tracks that didn't match any known species. "The stride length suggests something big," she explained, measuring the distance between prints. "But the impression pattern is all wrong. It's like it's walking on 2 legs, but the weight distribution is impossible for any known bipedal animal." As dusk approached, we made camp near the edge of the dead zone. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The silence pressed against our ears like a physical presence. The rhythmic thumping started at midnight. At first it was barely noticeable, a low vibration you felt more than heard. But it grew stronger, more insistent, like a massive heart beating beneath the earth. Our equipment began to malfunction, screens flickering with static. "Movement 200 meters north," Sam whispered, his thermal scope scanning the tree line. But whatever he saw vanished before the rest of us could confirm it. The thumping grew louder, closer. Tree branches swayed without wind. The air became thick, making it difficult to breathe. Then we heard the scream, not human, not animal, but something in between. It echoed through the forest, setting our teeth on edge. Eric's hands flew across his keyboard, getting massive electromagnetic spikes. "Whatever it is, it's—" His words cut off as something large crashed through the underbrush behind him. In the beam of our flashlights, we caught a glimpse of dark fur, gleaming eyes, and teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp. The attack was swift and brutal. Eric never had a chance to run. The creature moved with impossible speed, its massive form defying physics. One moment Eric was there, the next he was gone, leaving only a spray of blood across his equipment. The next 24 hours became a desperate game of survival. We abandoned most of our gear, taking only weapons and essential supplies. The creature toyed with us, herding us deeper into its territory. We'd hear the thumping from one direction, only to have it suddenly appear behind us. Lisa tried to analyze its behavior. "It's intelligent," she said as we took shelter in a ravine. "It's not just hunting us, it's studying us, learning our patterns." Her scientific detachment was cracking, fear showing through the professional facade. Sam's military training kept us alive through the second night. He set up defensive positions, laid false trails, did everything by the book. But the creature didn't play by any rules we understood. It came for him during his watch, moving so fast our bullets seemed to pass right through it. His last words were a warning. "Run." Then the darkness took him, his screams mixing with the sound of breaking bones. We found the cabin just before dawn, an old ranger station, long abandoned. Lisa's hand shook as she helped me barricade the doors and windows. We were running on adrenaline and fear, our minds struggling to process what we'd seen. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Nothing moves like that. Nothing should be that strong." I had no answers. In 15 years of hunting monsters, I'd never encountered anything like this. The reports, the photos, nothing had prepared us for the reality of what stalked these woods. The creature came for us as the sun set. The thumping grew until the whole cabin shook, dust falling from the ceiling. Lisa fired through a window, the muzzle flash illuminating a shape that seemed to shift and change in the darkness. The thing that burst through the wall was nightmare-made flesh. Its fur absorbed light, its eyes held an intelligence that was terrifying in its alienness. Lisa's bullets struck it, drawing blood that seemed to evaporate before it hit the ground. I fought with everything I had, but it was like fighting a force of nature. The creature threw me across the room with casual strength. Through blurred vision, I saw it take Lisa. Her screams faded into the forest, leaving me alone with the knowledge that I had failed to protect my team. The official report lists it as a bear attack. 3 federal agents killed in the line of duty while investigating wildlife disturbances. My testimony was quietly buried, along with any evidence that might suggest something more sinister. I left the unit after that, opened a small bookstore in Vermont, surrounded myself with stories that make sense, that have beginnings and endings, but the memories of Pine Hollow haunt me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear a familiar thumping in the distance. The locals here tell stories about missing hikers, about strange sounds in the woods. I wonder if it followed me, if it's still out there, watching, waiting, or maybe there are more of them, spreading slowly across the dark places of our world. The thought keeps me awake at night, staring at the ceiling, remembering the look in its eyes, ancient, hungry, and terrifyingly aware. The government still sends teams to investigate strange occurrences in remote places. I've heard whispers of similar incidents in other forests, other small towns, but I won't go back. I've seen what lurks in the shadows, and I know that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Yet sometimes when the wind blows through the trees and the shadows grow long, I find myself reaching for my old gear, checking my weapons, because deep down I know the truth. The creature of Pine Hollow is still out there, and one day it might come looking for the one who got away. My name is James Jones, and this happened to me on August 14th, 1998. I was 32 years old at the time, working as a search and rescue officer in a small town called Pinecrest, Maine. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, tucked away in the dense forests near the Canadian border. Nothing much ever happened in Pinecrest, which is probably why I took to my job with such dedication. But let me tell you, nothing could have prepared me for the horrors I witnessed that summer. The day started like any other. I was at the station, sipping on a stale cup of coffee and trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. Our team was small, just me and my partner Tom Halloran, along with a handful of volunteers we could call on if needed. Tom and I had been working together for years, and we had a good rhythm. We knew the forests around Pinecrest like the back of our hands, or so we thought. Around 10 a.m., a call came in about a missing hiker. A woman named Claire Donovan, age 28, had gone out for a hike the previous morning and hadn't returned. Her husband, Hank, was frantic with worry. Claire was an experienced hiker, he told us over the phone. She knew the trails well. It wasn't like her to just disappear. Tom and I met Hank at the trailhead. He was a tall, wiry man with a thick beard, and the dark circles under his eyes told me he hadn't slept a wink. "She's done this hike a dozen times," he kept saying, his voice strained with anxiety. "She knows the area like the back of her hand." We assured Hank that we'd do everything we could to find his wife. Tom and I set out, calling in a couple of volunteers to help with the search. The trail was one we were familiar with, a moderately challenging hike that led up through dense pine forest and then along the edge of a steep ridge. It was a beautiful area, but treacherous if you didn't know what you were doing. We figured Claire might have twisted an ankle or gotten turned around. It happens, even to experienced hikers. The first few hours of the search were uneventful. We called Claire's name until our voices were hoarse, scanned the thick underbrush for any sign of disturbance, checked the trail for footprints or broken branches. But there was nothing. It was as if Claire had simply vanished into thin air. By late afternoon, a sense of unease had settled over our small search party. This was longer than any search should have taken, especially on a trail we knew so well. Hank was beside himself with worry, pacing at the trailhead like a caged animal. We had to gently but firmly tell him to stay put. The last thing we needed was another person getting lost in the forest. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, painting the trees in shades of gold and crimson, Tom and I made the decision to push deeper into the woods. We left the main trail, following a narrow game path that snaked through the undergrowth. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing close, their branches intertwined overhead, until only slivers of the fading light penetrated the canopy. It was then that we found the first sign of Claire. It was a scarf, a bright splash of red against the muted greens and browns of the forest floor. It had snagged on a broken branch, fluttering forlornly in the breeze. Tom and I exchanged a look. Hank had mentioned Claire was wearing a red scarf when she set out. "Over here," I called to Tom, my voice sounding muffled in the heavy air. He jogged over, his boots crunching on the carpet of pine needles. We both stared at the scarf, a sense of foreboding settling over us like a shroud. "Think she just dropped it?" Tom asked, but there was doubt in his voice. I wasn't sure. "Maybe, but let's keep moving. We're on the right track." We pressed on, calling Claire's name, the sound echoing back to us from the indifferent trees. The light was fading fast now, shadows pooling beneath the pines. About an hour later, as we were fighting our way through a particularly dense patch of underbrush, we found another clue. It was a water bottle, half buried in the soft loam. Tom picked it up, turning it over in his hands. There was a name scribbled on the side in black marker: Claire. A jolt of excitement mixed with apprehension shot through me. We were close now, I could feel it. But it was the next discovery that stopped us cold. We stumbled into a small clearing, and at first glance it appeared to be an ordinary campsite. But something was off. There were no tents, no sleeping bags, no cheerfully crackling campfire. Instead, there was a haphazard circle of stones, the ashes inside them long cold. Scattered around were a few forlorn-looking belongings, a tattered backpack, a single hiking boot, a rusted pocket knife. Tom and I stood there, the hair on the backs of our necks standing up. This was no ordinary campsite. It looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry, and a long time ago. But the most unsettling thing was the silence. The forest was always quiet, but this was different. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. And then we saw it, partially hidden beneath a drift of leaves, almost as if it had been placed there deliberately, was a shoe. A woman's hiking boot, the mate to the one we'd seen earlier. Tom picked it up gingerly, as if it might bite him. He turned it over in his hands, his face grim. "This is Claire's, isn't it?" he asked, although it wasn't really a question. "I think so," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, thin and strained. "But what the hell is this place?" Neither of us had an answer. A glance at the sky told us night was fast approaching. It wasn't safe to keep searching in the dark, not in this part of the forest. Reluctantly, we decided to make camp nearby and resume our search at first light. We pitched our small two-man tent in a spot that gave us a clear view of the strange campsite. As Tom set about building a fire, more for comfort than warmth in the muggy August night, I radioed back to the station. I told them what we'd found, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. They promised to send out additional search parties in the morning to widen the search radius. Hank, they told me, was still at the trailhead, refusing to leave. That night was one of the longest of my life. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the tent ceiling, my mind whirring. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, had me jerking upright, my heart pounding. Tom seemed to be faring no better. I could hear him tossing and turning, his breathing heavy in the darkness. At some point I must have drifted into a fitful sleep because I woke with a start. It took me a moment to realize what had woken me. It was a scream, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the trees. Beside me, Tom sat bolt upright, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I was already scrambling out of my sleeping bag, fumbling for my boots. It sounded like it came from the north. We burst out of the tent, flashlights in hand. The scream came again, louder this time and filled with terror. It was a woman's voice, Claire's voice. "This way," I yelled, plunging into the trees. Tom was right behind me, his breathing harsh in the still night air. We ran, heedless of the branches that whipped at our faces, the roots that tried to trip us. The screams grew louder, more desperate, urging us onward, and then as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the screams. We burst into another clearing, and the scene before us was like something out of a nightmare. Claire was there, her body sprawled on the forest floor. But she wasn't alone. Crouched over her was a creature straight out of a horror movie. It was humanoid, but larger than any man I'd ever seen. Its skin was a sickly grayish-green, covered in what looked like scales. But it was its face that I'll never forget. It had no nose, just two slitted nostrils. Its eyes were large and black, reflecting the light of our flashlights, and its mouth, it was wide and gaping, filled with rows of needle-like teeth. The creature looked up as we entered the clearing and let out a hiss that sent shivers down my spine. It moved, faster than I would have believed possible for something that size, and vanished into the trees. For a moment we stood frozen, our minds struggling to process what we had just seen. Then a low moan from Claire snapped us out of it. We rushed to her side. She was alive, but barely. Her clothes were shredded, and her body was covered in deep, vicious-looking gashes. She stared up at us, her eyes glassy with shock and pain. It came out of nowhere," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I couldn't. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she went limp. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought we'd lost her. But then I saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was still breathing, but she needed medical attention, and fast. We carried her out of those woods, taking turns when our arms grew tired. It was a brutal hike, made all the more difficult by the darkness and our growing fear. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every sound made us jump. By the time we reached the trailhead, we were both exhausted, physically and mentally. Hank was there, pacing under the harsh glare of the floodlights. When he saw us, Claire's limp form cradled in Tom's arms, he let out a sound I'll never forget, half sob, half scream. He ran to us, his hands hovering over his wife's still form, afraid to touch her. The next few hours passed in a blur. An ambulance came, whisking Claire away to the hospital. Hank went with her, his face a mask of grief and fear. Tom and I gave our statements to the local police, trying our best to describe what we'd seen without sounding completely insane. I could tell by the looks on their faces that they didn't believe us, not really, but the evidence of the attack on Claire was undeniable. Something had hurt her, something that definitely wasn't human. In the days that followed, a sense of dread settled over Pinecrest. More people went missing, hikers and campers who ventured into the woods and never came out. Search parties were sent out, but they found nothing, no trace of the missing people. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Claire miraculously survived her ordeal, but she was changed, and not just physically. She was haunted, jumping at every sound, every unexpected movement. She spoke of the creature in the woods, the thing that had attacked her. But no one believed her. They put it down to trauma, to the stress of her ordeal. Only Tom and I knew the truth. We had seen it with our own eyes. We tried to hunt it, to track it down. We spent days combing the woods, setting traps, following trails that always seemed to lead nowhere. It was like the creature was toying with us, always one step ahead. And with each passing day, the fear in Pinecrest grew. People started locking their doors at night, keeping their children inside. The woods, once a place of beauty and tranquility, became a place of terror. And then, just when we thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. We found a body, or what was left of one. It was a hiker, a man named Ethan Boyd. He had been torn apart, his body scattered across a small clearing deep in the woods. It was a scene of unimaginable horror, and it broke something inside me. I knew then that we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding, something evil. The attacks escalated from there. More bodies were found, each one more gruesome than the last. People started leaving Pinecrest, packing up their lives and fleeing in the middle of the night. Those who remained lived in a constant state of terror, jumping at every shadow. The town was dying, and we seemed powerless to stop it. And then one night, the creature came for me. I was at home trying to catch a few hours of restless sleep when I heard a sound outside my window. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. I grabbed my gun, my hand shaking so badly I could barely load it. I crept to the window, my heart pounding in my ears, and there it was, crouched in the shadows of my yard. Its black eyes seemed to bore into me, and I swear I saw something like amusement in them, as if it knew how terrified I was. I don't know what would have happened if Tom hadn't shown up when he did. He burst into my house, his own gun drawn. Together we managed to drive the creature back into the woods, but I knew it wouldn't be gone for long. It would be back, and it would keep coming back until it got what it wanted. What that was, I didn't know. All I knew was that we had to stop it, before it destroyed everything and everyone I cared about. The final confrontation happened deep in the heart of the forest, in a place even the most experienced hikers avoided. Tom and I, along with a handful of the bravest, or perhaps most foolish, men and women of Pinecrest, tracked the creature to its lair. It was a place of darkness and death, the ground littered with the bones of its victims. The battle was brutal. The creature was strong, stronger than anything I had ever faced. It moved with a speed and agility that defied belief, and its claws cut through flesh like a knife through butter. We lost good people that day, friends and neighbors, people I had known my entire life. But in the end we prevailed. The creature lay dead at our feet, its black blood staining the earth. But even in death it seemed to mock us, because we never found out what it was or where it had come from. Some said it was a mutation, a product of the toxic waste that had been illegally dumped in the woods years before. Others claimed it was something older, something that had always been there, waiting in the shadows. I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that it was over, and Pinecrest could start to heal. But for me there was no healing. The horrors I had seen, the friends I had lost, they haunted me. I left Pinecrest not long after, unable to stay in the place that held so many painful memories. I drifted for a while, trying to find somewhere I belonged, but I never could quite shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me in the darkness. And sometimes in the deepest part of the night I swear I can hear it, that low, guttural growl that still sends shivers down my spine. And I wonder, is it really over? Or is it still out there somewhere, waiting for its next victim? I pray I never find out, but in my heart I know the truth. Evil like that never really dies. It just waits, biding its time until it can strike again. I'm John Anderson, 79 years old now, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me back in 1987. I was just a regular guy then, working as an electrician in Philadelphia. Nothing fancy about my life, just work, beer on Fridays, and weekends spent either fixing things around the house or watching the Eagles play. My wife Marla was pregnant with our first kid, and money was tight. So when my buddy Calvin offered up his family's cabin in the Poconos for a week, I jumped at the chance. A week away from the city sounded like heaven, and maybe some time alone would give me the clarity I needed about becoming a father. Calvin couldn't make it himself. Some last-minute work thing came up, but he gave me the keys and directions. Before I left, I promised Marla I'd be back before she even started to miss me. She just laughed and said, "Just don't forget to call me every day." The drive was uneventful, just me and the open road, winding through dense forests and up into the mountains. The cabin was a rustic little place, perched on the edge of a small, serene lake. It had a wraparound porch, a stone fireplace, and that musty smell of old wood and dust that you can only get in places like this. It felt like stepping back in time, and I loved it. I spent the first couple of days fishing, hiking, and reading old magazines I found in the cabin. It was nice to be away from the noise and stress of the city, to just breathe in the fresh air and let my mind wander. I even made a campfire one night and tried to remember how to play the guitar, which I hadn't touched since high school. It was the kind of simple, peaceful existence I hadn't realized I'd been missing. On the third day, things took a turn. I was out on the porch, sipping a beer and watching the sunset when I saw movement in the tree line across the lake. It was too far to make out any details, just a dark shape slipping between the trees. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but it disappeared before I could figure out what it was. Probably just a deer, I told myself, but something about it didn't sit right with me. It moved too quickly, too smoothly. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing noises outside, branches snapping and the occasional rustle of leaves. The kind of sounds you'd expect in the woods, sure, but they seemed too close, too deliberate. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next morning I found tracks around the cabin. They were big, too big to be any animal I was familiar with, and definitely not human. Deep, wide prints that seemed to have claws at the ends. I took a few photos with the disposable camera I'd brought, and tried to convince myself it was some kind of bear, even though I knew it didn't make sense. Bears don't move like that, and their tracks don't look like these. I decided to head into town, get some supplies, and maybe ask around if anyone had seen anything unusual. The nearest town was about 30 minutes away, a small place called Millvale. It had a general store, a diner, and not much else. I grabbed some groceries and stopped by the diner for a coffee, hoping to strike up a conversation with the locals. There was an old guy at the counter, nursing a cup of black coffee and reading a newspaper. He looked like he'd been around forever, with a weathered face and a trucker hat that had seen better days. "Morning," I said, trying to sound casual. "Morning," he replied without looking up. "I'm staying out at a cabin on Lake Willow," I said. "Been seeing some weird tracks around, big ones. Any idea what they might be?" He looked up then, his eyes narrowing. "Lake Willow, you say?" "Yeah, just across the lake from the old Johnson place." He nodded slowly. "Ain't many folks go out that way no more, not since the disappearances." That got my attention. "Disappearances?" He sipped his coffee and shrugged. "Couple years back, some folks went missing around those woods. Never found them. Some say it was wild animals, others think something else, I don't know. But you be careful out there." I thanked him for the warning, but I wasn't sure what to make of it. Disappearances, strange tracks, maybe there was something to it, or maybe it was just small-town rumors. Either way, it put me on edge. When I got back to the cabin, I double-checked all the windows and doors, making sure everything was locked up tight. I kept the fire going and stayed inside, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, the noises were louder, closer. Something was definitely out there, and it wasn't just my imagination. I decided to stay up, sitting in the dark with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, the only weapons I had. Around midnight, I heard something scratching at the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept closer, trying to see through the peephole. All I saw was darkness, but the scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like whatever it was knew I was inside. I flicked on the porch light, hoping to scare it off, but all it did was reveal a large, shadowy figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall, hunched over, with long, sinewy limbs and eyes that glowed a sickly yellow in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as it let out a low, guttural sound that chilled me to the bone. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I needed to get out of there, but my truck was parked out front, and I'd have to go through the thing to get to it. I grabbed my keys and made a decision. I'd make a run for it. I threw open the door and sprinted towards the truck, not daring to look back. The creature let out a roar and lunged after me. I could hear its footsteps pounding the ground behind me as I fumbled with the keys, trying to unlock the door. I managed to get it open and jumped inside, slamming the door shut just as it reached me. The thing smashed against the side of the truck, its claws raking against the metal, but I didn't stick around to see what it would do next. I gunned the engine and tore out of there, not stopping until I was back in Millvale. I went straight to the police station and told them everything. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Hank Briscoe, listened with a skeptical look on his face. He had heard stories like mine before, he said, but there was never any evidence to back them up. Still, he agreed to send a couple of deputies out to the cabin to check it out. I spent the night at a motel, jumping at every sound, unable to sleep. The next morning, Sheriff Briscoe called to tell me they'd found the cabin empty. No sign of any creature or strange tracks, just some scratches on the door and the side of my truck. He suggested I head back to Philadelphia and forget about it, chalk it up to an overactive imagination. But I knew what I'd seen, and I couldn't just forget about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting. I decided to cut my trip short and head back home. I didn't want to leave Marla alone any longer than necessary, especially not with a baby on the way. I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind, but it wasn't easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those yellow eyes staring back at me. A few weeks later, I got a call from Calvin. He'd finally made it up to the cabin and found my disposable camera. The photos I took of the tracks were still on it, and he had them developed. He sounded shaken, said he was coming over to show me. When he arrived, he handed me the photos without a word. The tracks were clear as day, big and clawed, just like I remembered. But there was one photo I didn't take, a close-up of those yellow eyes staring right into the camera. We never talked about it again. I kept the photos locked away, a reminder of what I'd seen, but never showed them to anyone else. I tried to move on, focus on my family, and forget about that week in the woods. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those noises, those scratches at the door. And I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting. Years passed, and life moved on. Marla gave birth to our son, Jake, and we settled into a routine. I never went back to the cabin, and neither did Calvin. We both made unspoken promises to stay away from those woods. One night, years later, I was watching TV when the news came on about another disappearance near Lake Willow. A group of campers had gone missing, leaving behind their gear and a campsite that looked like it had been attacked by something wild. My heart sank as I listened to the report, knowing deep down that whatever had haunted me all those years ago was still out there. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to do something, even if it meant facing that creature again. I couldn't let more people disappear without at least trying to stop it. I gathered my things, including the old photos and a hunting rifle I'd bought after that trip, and headed back to the Poconos. When I arrived in Millvale, it was like stepping back in time. The town hadn't changed much, and neither had the old guy at the diner. He recognized me instantly and nodded as I walked in. "Back again, huh?" he said. "Figured you'd stay away after what happened." "I can't," I replied. "People are still going missing. I have to do something." He looked at me for a long moment before nodding. "Be careful out there. Whatever it is, it's dangerous." I thanked him and headed to the cabin. It looked the same as it had all those years ago, maybe a bit more run down. I parked the truck, loaded my rifle, and started a fire in the fireplace. I wasn't planning on sleeping. I was here to confront whatever had been terrorizing these woods. As the sun set, the familiar noises started again. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. Only this time I was ready. I sat by the fire, rifle in hand, waiting. Hours passed, and just when I was starting to think nothing would happen, I heard it, the scratching at the door. I took a deep breath, stood up, and walked to the door. I flicked on the porch light, just like before, and opened the door, rifle at the ready. There it was, the creature from my nightmares, tall, hunched over with those same sickly yellow eyes. It let out a low growl and took a step towards me. I didn't hesitate. I fired the rifle, hitting it square in the chest. It let out a scream of pain and stumbled back, but it didn't go down. I fired again and again until the rifle was empty and the creature lay still on the ground. I stood there, breathing heavily, my heart pounding in my chest. It was over. I'd done it. I walked over to the creature, still cautious, and examined it. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a twisted mix of animal and something else entirely. I took a few more photos, just to be sure, and then dragged it away from the cabin. I called the sheriff the next morning and told him everything. He was skeptical, but when he saw the photos and the body, he couldn't deny it. They took it away for examination, and I never heard what became of it. Life went back to normal after that. The disappearances stopped, and people started returning to Lake Willow. I kept the rifle and the photos as a reminder of what I'd faced, but I didn't dwell on it. I had a family to take care of, and that was more important. Years later, when Jake was old enough, I told him the story. He didn't believe me at first, but when I showed him the photos, he couldn't deny it. I hoped he'd never have to face something like that, but I wanted him to be prepared, just in case. Now I'm an old man, and the memories of that week in the woods are still vivid. I don't know what that creature was or where it came from, but I know one thing: it's gone. And I made sure it would never hurt anyone again. As I sit here telling you this story, I can't help but think about the old guy at the diner and his warning. He knew something was out there, something dangerous. And he was right. So if you ever find yourself up near Lake Willow, be careful. You never know what might be lurking in the woods. And always remember to keep your door locked. The year was 2009, and after years of dreaming about it, I was finally embarking on a solo multi-week trek through the Pacific Northwest. Ever since I first read Cheryl Strayed's memoir Wild, I had been longing to experience the rugged beauty of this region for myself. As an avid hiker, I felt well prepared for the journey ahead. My plan was to start in Oregon on the famed Pacific Crest Trail and make my way north. I had meticulously researched my route, gathered all the necessary gear, and mentally steeled myself for the challenges and solitude that awaited me. There was something almost spiritual about being alone in nature like this. With each step, I could feel the stress and noise of my everyday life fading further into the background. Out here it was just me, the trail, and the vast wilderness stretching out in every direction. The first leg of my trek took me through the dense, old-growth forests of Oregon. The trees towered above me, their trunks so wide that it would take several people linking arms to encircle them. Lush ferns and colorful wildflowers dotted the forest floor. The air was cool and damp, filled with the earthy scent of soil and vegetation. As the days passed, I fell into a comfortable rhythm. Wake up at dawn, break camp, hike until my legs ached and my stomach rumbled, then set up camp again as dusk settled over the forest. Repeat. My body grew stronger and my mind clearer with each passing mile. By the time I reached the Columbia River Gorge marking the border between Oregon and Washington, I was in the groove, ready to tackle the next stage of my journey. I decided to take a couple rest days to explore the Washington side of the gorge before continuing north. The Columbia River Gorge took my breath away. It was a stunning river valley, with sheer basalt cliffs rising up on either side. Ribbons of waterfalls cascaded down the rock faces, their spray creating an ethereal mist that hung in the air. The cliffs were adorned with a thick carpet of evergreens and maples. I set up a base camp in a quaint town near the gorge and began researching nearby trails to explore during my layover. One in particular caught my eye, a less traveled path that promised spectacular waterfall views deep in the heart of the forest. I knew immediately it was the one I wanted to tackle. Little did I know as I settled into my sleeping bag that night, excitement buzzing through my travel-weary limbs, that the adventure I thought I was so well prepared for was about to take a drastic turn into the unknown. A turn that would shake the very foundations of what I believed to be real and possible in this world. But in that moment, blissfully unaware of what lay ahead, I drifted off to sleep with a smile on my face, eager to see what wonders the trail had in store for me next. The Pacific Northwest had already captured my heart. I couldn't wait to discover more of its secrets. I set off early the next morning, practically jumping out of my boots with anticipation to hit the trail again after a few sedentary days in town. The weather was perfect, blue skies peeking through a light layer of clouds, a slight breeze rustling the leaves, the air crisp and invigorating. The first few miles of the hike lived up to everything I had imagined and more. The trail wound through a verdant wonderland, a sea of green in every direction. Lush ferns grew as tall as trees, their delicate fronds brushing my arms as I passed. The forest here felt primordial, untouched by time. Every bend in the path revealed another breathtaking sight. I crossed babbling brooks on sturdy log bridges, watched sunbeams filter through the dense canopy and dapple the forest floor with golden light. But most spectacular of all were the waterfalls. The roar of falling water echoed from what seemed like every direction, a constant symphony of nature. I passed by stunning cascades of all sizes, from delicate trickles adorning the rocks to massive multi-tiered falls that thundered down into crystal-clear pools below. I took my time, often pausing to simply soak in the tranquil beauty surrounding me. At one particularly scenic overlook, I treated myself to a leisurely trailside lunch perched atop a giant, moss-covered boulder. I remember breathing deeply, feeling a profound sense of peace and connection wash over me. It's funny how such perfect, unspoiled moments have a way of lulling you into a false sense of security. Because it was there, in that state of utter contentment and oneness with nature, that everything started to shift. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the landscape began to change in subtle but unsettling ways. The underbrush grew thicker, the tree canopy denser, allowing only sparse shards of sunlight to penetrate through to the forest floor. The air felt heavier too, cooler and strangely oppressive. Soon I reached a section of trail that looked different than anything I had encountered thus far. The path ahead took a sharp turn, leading into a shadowy grove that had an oddly forbidding quality to it. The trees here had a strange, almost twisted appearance, their branches reaching out at contorted angles as if to snag unsuspecting passers-by. Now, I've never been one to put much stock in superstition or paranormal mumbo-jumbo. I'm a rational guy, a believer in science and cold, hard facts. But standing at the threshold of that strange copse, I couldn't suppress the shiver that ran down my spine or the tug of hesitation that rooted my boots to the dirt. I found myself thinking back to the bits of lore and legend I had picked up about these ancient forests, whispers of them being sacred places, jealously guarded by spirits that didn't take kindly to trespassers. Of course, I had always chalked those stories up to colorful myths, the fanciful imaginings of a people trying to explain a world they didn't fully understand. But alone out there, faced with the unfamiliar, those legends didn't feel quite so far-fetched anymore. I stood at the crossroads, one part of me yearning to plunge ahead into the unknown, the other questioning the wisdom of such a choice. In the end, the adventurer in me won out over the wary voice of caution. I had come all this way to experience the wild, raw beauty of the Pacific Northwest, and I wasn't about to let a few shadows and an overactive imagination turn me back now. Taking a deep breath to steady my nerves, I adjusted the straps of my pack and stepped forward into the waiting gloom, ready to meet whatever challenges the trail had in store head-on. If only I had known then just how wholly unprepared I was for what lay ahead. That single step was about to send me hurtling down a path stranger and more terrifying than anything I could have possibly imagined. But in that moment, heart drumming with anticipation, I forged onward, blissfully unaware that my perception of the world and my place in it was about to be irrevocably shattered. As I ventured deeper into the shadowy grove, an eerie silence enveloped me. The birdsong and insect chatter that had been my constant companions throughout the hike thus far suddenly ceased. Even the omnipresent roar of distant waterfalls seemed to be swallowed up by the oppressive hush. My footsteps echoing solemnly on the twisting trail, I couldn't shake the unnerving sensation of being watched. I found my gaze constantly flitting from side to side, scanning the dense foliage for anything out of the ordinary. A few times I thought I glimpsed subtle movement, a strange rustling in the undergrowth, but when I focused on the spot, it was always just the usual play of light and shadow. The further I trekked into the strange forest, the more my disquiet grew. It was as if the very air was weighted with a presence, heavy and watchful. I tried to dismiss it as a product of my imagination, an understandable case of nerves brought on by the unfamiliar surroundings and the old superstitions floating through my head. I was a man of science, after all, not some gullible believer in ghostly guardians and ancient curses. I pressed on, convincing myself that the unease was temporary, that like every other challenge I had faced on the trail thus far, it would pass. I had to prove to myself that I was tougher than a cluster of gloomy trees and some goosebump-inducing folklore. Boy, was I ever wrong. Nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to stumble onto in the depths of that forest. The trail eventually spilled out into a small clearing, and at its center stood a tree unlike any I had ever laid eyes on before. Massive and ancient, it loomed over the surrounding woods, its trunk so thick that if 5 grown men linked arms, they still wouldn't be able to encircle it. Gnarled roots as big around as my thigh erupted from the ground at its base, twisting over and around each other in a tangled maze before plunging back into the dark earth. The lowest branches were easily 30 feet overhead. It would have taken 3 of me standing on each other's shoulders to even come close to reaching them. But it wasn't just the size of the tree that struck me. There was something about its very presence, a weight to it that transcended the physical. Standing before it, I felt an almost electric hum vibrating in my bones, a sense of barely bridled power thrumming beneath its rough bark. I found myself drawn towards the behemoth, pulled by a curiosity I couldn't fully explain. As I drew closer, a flicker of white against the charcoal-gray trunk caught my eye. There, etched deep into the bark about 5 feet up, was a strange symbol unlike any I had ever seen before. 3 short diagonal lines were marred across the middle by a perfect circle. It looked deliberate, almost branded into the wood. I reached out, fingers itching to trace the lines, to assure myself that they were real and not some trick of the light. The instant my skin made contact with the rough bark, all hell broke loose. An earth-shattering shriek pierced the silence of the glade, seeming to erupt from the branches high above. I stumbled back, heart jackhammering against my ribcage as the cry echoed harshly through the trees. Eyes wide with shock and terror, I searched frantically for the source of the god-awful racket, but no matter how I craned my neck, I could see nothing but a dense tangle of leaves rustling vigorously, even though there wasn't the slightest breath of wind to stir them. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the shrieking cut off, plunging the clearing back into that unnatural silence. I stood frozen, scarcely daring to breathe. That was when I heard it, a wet thud followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy crashing through the branches. I stumbled further back from the tree just as a large dark mass plummeted from the canopy and hit the ground mere feet from where I stood. I stared in mute horror. It took my shell-shocked brain a moment to process what I was seeing. Lying in a crumpled heap at the base of the tree was the mangled carcass of a deer, its warm blood already soaking into the loam. My eyes jerked involuntarily upwards, back to the thick branches from whence the grisly parcel had fallen. Fear, unlike anything I had ever known, rooted me to the spot as my mind struggled and failed to comprehend what I saw next. There, hunched on one of the highest boughs, was an immense dark figure. Though it blended almost perfectly into the shadows, there was no mistaking the sheer mass of the thing as it clung effortlessly to a branch that should have buckled under its weight. A scream lodged in my throat as the hulking shape shifted, leaning forward on its perch. In the dim light filtering through the leaves, I could just make out a few heart-stopping details. The creature was covered head to toe in a thick coat of shaggy, pitch-black fur. Curved claws the size of hunting knives flashed at the tips of its long, powerful arms. But it was the face that sent a bolt of pure, unadulterated terror spearing through me. Yellow eyes like twin flames glowered down from beneath a heavy, sloping brow, seeming to bore right into my very soul. A mouth filled with jagged, razor-sharp teeth twisted in an expression I could only interpret as a snarl. And then it hit me, the realization crashing into me with the force of a freight train. I was staring into the leering visage of a creature that wasn't supposed to exist outside of campfire tales and low-budget horror flicks. Bigfoot. A hysterical laugh tried to bubble up my throat at the sheer absurdity of the thought, but there was no denying the very real, very tangible threat looming over me in all its terrifying glory. All my long-held beliefs, my steadfast convictions in the logical, rational world, collapsed like a house of cards in the face of the primal nightmare made flesh before my eyes. Some deep instinctual part of me screamed at me to run, to flee as far and as fast as my legs could carry me. But I was paralyzed, caught in the crimson glare of the beast like a deer in the headlights. For a handful of heartbeats that could have been hours, we remained locked in that macabre tableau, the creature never once blinking as it studied me. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the depths of its throat, almost too low to be audible but impossible to ignore as it vibrated through the soles of my boots to shake me to my core. And then the stench hit my nose, a nauseating cocktail of bestial musk and rotting flesh so overpowering it brought tears to my eyes. That was the trigger that finally jolted me into action like a splash of cold water to the face. Blind panic overrode any remaining vestiges of logical thought as I spun on my heel and bolted back in the direction I had come, heedless of the treacherous terrain. I vaulted roots and shrubbery, tore through tangles of vines and underbrush, mindless of the branches that snatched at my hair and clothes like skeletal fingers. Behind me, far too close for comfort, I could hear the sounds of pursuit. The boom of snapping wood, the rustle of crushed fern, the heavy thud of immense feet devouring the distance between us. I pelted down the trail, the ominous noises spurring me to heights of speed and endurance I would never have thought myself capable of. My lungs scorched, every gasping breath searing my throat like acid. The muscles in my legs screamed in protest as I pushed them past the point of exhaustion. But still I ran, propelled by the primal imperative to survive no matter the cost. Every sinew, every fiber of my being was focused on the singular goal of escaping the nightmare, with wickedly curved claws and hellfire eyes hunting me through the shadowed tangle of the forest. I didn't dare look back for fear of what horrors I might glimpse over my shoulder. The occasional snap of a broken branch, or the throaty chuff of labored breath nipping at my heels was reminder enough of how close my pursuer was. The trail blurred beneath my pounding feet, a never-ending gauntlet twisting through the trees. I had long since surrendered to instinct, my conscious mind unable to process more than a litany of desperate, half-formed prayers. Prayers for speed, for endurance, for the nightmare to end. Just as I was certain my body could take no more, the toe of my boot caught on a protruding root and sent me sprawling across the trail. I hit the dirt in an ungainly tangle of limbs, skidding to a halt in a patch of dry leaves and pine needles. All the wind rushed out of my lungs on impact, leaving me gasping like a fish out of water. The salty iron tang of blood filled my mouth where I had bitten my tongue. For a moment I could do no more than lie there, wheezing, fighting the blackness eating at the edges of my vision. But I hadn't even managed to draw a full breath before the hair on the back of my neck stood up, an electric crackle of dread slithering down my spine. The forest had gone quiet, too quiet, the kind of absolute suffocating hush that presses in like water, drowning out everything but the thunder of your own heartbeat in your ears. I squeezed my eyes shut, not daring to move. Because in that utter lack of sound, one thing was harrowingly, nauseatingly clear. Something was there, crouched beside my prone form, so close I could feel the heat radiating off its shaggy bulk, smell the choking stench of its fur, hear the soft whistle of air moving in and out of its lungs, a presence so large it seemed to eclipse the feeble light filtering down through the canopy. I lay paralyzed, certain that at any moment a crushing weight would descend on my back, that wicked claws would pierce my flesh to spill my lifeblood across the forest floor, that jagged teeth would close on my throat in a spray of crimson, and then nothing. But the blow never came. Instead, after a handful, they say you never forget your first encounter with true terror. For me, that unforgettable brush with the unknown came on July 9th, 2008, in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains. My name is Dalton Hayes, and I'm an electrician by trade, born and raised in the concrete jungle of New York City. The wild, untamed expanses of upstate New York were about as far from my everyday reality as you could get. But that was precisely the appeal when my childhood buddy Ezra suggested we rent a cabin up there for the long weekend. "Come on, man, it'll be great," Ezra had cajoled over beers at our regular dive bar. "Fresh air, fishing, a chance to actually see some stars for once. When was the last time you got out of this urban hellhole?" He had a point. The daily grind of the city, the incessant noise, the crowds, the grime, it had a way of wearing a man down to his bones. The thought of escaping to a place where the loudest sound was wind in the trees, and my only obligation was keeping a cooler stocked with beer, well, it had an undeniable allure. So that's how I found myself bumping along a barely there dirt track deep in the Adirondack woods, crammed into the passenger seat of Ezra's ancient pickup. With every pothole and jounce, I found myself questioning the wisdom of this little excursion. "You sure this rust bucket is going to make it easy?" I asked, bracing myself against the dashboard as we dipped into yet another crater masquerading as a road. "Have some faith, city boy," Ezra grinned, patting the dashboard with a grease-stained hand. "Old Blue might not look like much, but she's tougher than she looks, kinda like her owner." I snorted, taking in Ezra's stocky frame, the faded flannel straining across his beer gut. "Yeah, you're a real mountain man, all right. When was the last time you even left Brooklyn?" "Hey, I'll have you know my dad used to take me hunting up here every fall as a kid. Taught me everything he knew about tracking, survival in the wilderness, all that good stuff. This is my natural habitat, man." I held up my hands in mock surrender. All right. I bow to your superior outdoor skills, oh great woodsman. Just get us to this damn cabin in one piece, will ya?" Ezra just chuckled, cranking up the radio until the twangy strains of some country tune drowned out the truck's protesting engine. An hour and a few close calls with the local wildlife later, we finally pulled up in front of our home for the next few days. To call it rustic would have been an understatement. The rough-hewn log cabin looked like it had been plucked straight from the pages of a frontier novel, all weathered timbers and a slightly sagging porch. But any concerns about the accommodations flew out of my head as soon as I stepped out of the truck. The view was breathtaking. The cabin perched on the edge of a glassy lake, its surface reflecting the emerald pines and azure sky like a pristine mirror. The air smelled of earth and evergreen and a subtle, clean scent I couldn't quite place, but I knew instinctively belonged to the unsullied wild. "Okay, I take it back," I said, breathing deep. "This is pretty damn spectacular. How'd you even find this place?" Ezra shrugged, already starting to unload our gear from the truck bed. "Friend of a friend knew a guy. You know how it goes. Apparently this place doesn't get much use, so we got it dirt cheap. Fine by me. More space between us and the nearest annoying tourist, right?" I couldn't argue with that. The isolation that had unsettled me on the drive in now felt like a blessing, a cocoon against the stresses and demands of the outside world. Out here it was just me, my best friend, and the unspoiled beauty of the mountains. If only I had known then how fleeting that sense of peace would be, how the very isolation I craved would soon become a trap, turning the wilderness from a tranquil haven to a stalking ground for something I still can't fully explain or understand to this day. But in that moment, basking in the warm afternoon sunlight, cold beer in hand as Ezra got a campfire going, all felt right in the world. I was exactly where I needed to be, even if I didn't realize that where I needed to be was as far away from those woods as humanly possible. The first day passed in a pleasant blur of hiking, fishing, and just generally soaking up the peaceful atmosphere. As the sun began its lazy descent towards the tree line, painting the sky in vivid streaks of orange and pink, Ezra and I settled in by the fire, passing a bottle of whiskey back and forth. The warmth of the alcohol mingled pleasantly with the bone-deep relaxation from a day spent in nature's embrace. Ezra was in the middle of a long yarn about his last failed romantic entanglement, when the first discordant note crept into the evening's tranquility. It started as a sound, a faint scratching noise from the direction of the cabin. At first I dismissed it, figuring it was just the wind rustling through the dried leaves clinging to the old logs. But it persisted, growing louder and more distinct until it was impossible to ignore. Ezra trailed off mid-sentence, his brow furrowing as he cocked his head towards the sound. "You hear that? Sounds like something's trying to get in." A prickle of unease crept up my spine as my mind conjured up images of hungry bears or ill-tempered raccoons. But I forced a laugh, trying to dispel the sudden tension. It's probably just some critter looking for an easy meal. We should have been more careful with the trash. Even as I said it, something about my own words rang hollow. There was an edge to the sound, a persistence that didn't feel quite natural. But Ezra seemed to accept my explanation, shrugging and turning back to the fire. We lapsed into a silence that no longer felt quite so companionable, both of us stealing the occasional glance towards the cabin. The scratching continued, rising and falling in an erratic rhythm, and then just as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. Ezra let out a nervous chuckle. "Maybe you were right about the bears. Guess it gave up when it realized there was no picnic basket waiting." "Yeah," I agreed, trying to match his forcibly light tone. "Yogi'll have to find his snacks somewhere else tonight." We settled back into our fireside banter, but the earlier ease was gone, replaced by a watchfulness I could see mirrored in the tense set of Ezra's shoulders. As we banked the fire and made our way inside, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something had shifted in the atmosphere of our little oasis. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Even with a few more shots of whiskey humming through my veins, I found myself tossing and turning on the lumpy mattress, straining my ears against the oppressive silence of the cabin's interior. The night pressed in close, somehow seeming fuller, heavier than any darkness I'd experienced before. Every creak of settling wood, every sigh of the wind through the eaves set my nerves jangling. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just the unfamiliar surroundings, and Ezra's story playing tricks on my imagination. But some primal instinct, some inherited echo from the days when our ancestors huddled around flickering fires and jumped at shadows, kept me on a razor's edge of alertness. It was in that liminal space between waking and dreaming that I heard it. A heavy thump against the back door. My heart leapt into my throat as I bolted upright, the bed springs protesting loudly in the stillness. For a moment I sat frozen, every muscle taut as a bowstring as I strained to hear over the thunder of my own pulse. But there was only silence and the soft snores drifting from Ezra's room. I tried to convince myself it had just been the house settling, or maybe a branch falling against the door. Anything but the alternative my lizard brain kept throwing up. Something large and powerful testing the cabin's defenses. I finally drifted into an uneasy doze, just as the first pale fingers of dawn began to creep across the sky. My dreams were a confused jumble of dark shapes and yellowed fangs, the scratching at the window a constant, unsettling soundtrack. When I stumbled into the kitchen the next morning, gritty-eyed and cotton-mouthed, Ezra was already up, staring pensively into a mug of coffee. He glanced up as I entered, the bruised crescents under his eyes telling me I wasn't the only one who'd had a restless night. "Mornin'," he mumbled, nodding towards the coffee pot. "Hope you slept better than I did. Felt like every damn squirrel in the forest was tap-dancing on the roof last night." I grunted noncommittally, pouring myself a cup of the strong black brew. As the caffeine began to work its magic, I debated whether to bring up the scratching, the heavy thump in the night, but something held me back. An irrational fear that speaking the words aloud would give them weight, make them real in a way I wasn't quite ready to face. So instead I did what any city dweller worth his salt would do when confronted with the unsettling specter of the unknown. I buried it deep and focused on the concrete realities of bacon and eggs and the day's plans. But even as we set out for a day of swimming and hiking, Ezra determinedly chipper despite the strain around his eyes, I couldn't quite shake the uneasiness that had taken root in my gut. It followed me like a shadow, an uninvited guest on our little getaway that I couldn't seem to shake. As we tromped through the sun-dappled forest, the spicy scent of pine thick in our nostrils, I found myself jumping at every snapped twig, every rustle in the undergrowth. More than once I could have sworn I felt eyes on the back of my neck, a prickling certainty of being watched that had me whipping around only to be confronted with the empty woods. Ezra seemed similarly on edge, his usual exuberant chatter replaced by a tense watchfulness. We stuck closer to the cabin than originally planned, both of us unconsciously gravitating towards the illusion of safety offered by those rough-hewn walls. As the sun began its inevitable descent once more, painting the sky in shades of fire, the uneasiness that had dogged our steps all day crystallized into a leaden ball in the pit of my stomach. Something about the encroaching twilight felt different, heavier, like the very air was holding its breath in anticipation. We went through the motions of building a fire, cooking dinner over the flames, but there was no joy in it, no relaxation. The banter felt forced, brittle, each of us straining to hear past the crackle of the flames for any sign of the return of last night's visitor. It was fully dark by the time we gave up the pretense and retreated to the dubious sanctuary of the cabin. Ezra claimed first shower, leaving me to double and triple check the locks on the doors and windows. As if a thin veneer of brass and wood could stand against the growing certainty that something out there in the night had marked us, had decided we were fair game in a hunt we hadn't signed up for. I was just contemplating the merits of dragging the heavy oak dresser in front of the back door when the first guttural snarl sliced through the silence. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a cross between a wild dog's growl and the primal roar of some great cat. But threaded through it was an almost human quality, a dark intelligence that turned my blood to ice water in my veins. "Ezra?" I called out, ashamed at the tremor in my voice. "Please tell me that was you practicing your mating call and not what I think it was." There was a beat of silence, then Ezra emerged from the bathroom, his face pale beneath his usual ruddy complexion. "Unless my mating call sounds like a pissed-off grizzly with a sore throat, I don't think so, brother." We stood there staring at each other, the unspoken question heavy in the air between us. What the hell was that, and what did it want with us? Before either of us could formulate a response, the thudding began. It was the sound from the night before amplified 100-fold, a rhythmic pounding that shook the very foundation of the cabin. It was coming from all sides, the walls vibrating with each thunderous impact. Ezra's hand drifted unconsciously to the rifle hanging on the wall, a relic from the cabin's past owners. As if in response, a splintering crack rent the air, the sound of claws or talons or God knew what scrabbling against the back door. We were moving before conscious thought could catch up, Ezra ripping the rifle from its brackets while I frantically scanned for anything that could serve as a weapon. My hand closed around the handle of a cast-iron skillet, just as a shape darkened the window by the door. In the guttering light of the lantern, I could only make out an impression of bulk, of shaggy fur, and a flash of teeth that seemed too large, too numerous to belong to any natural creature. Ezra brought the rifle up to his shoulder, the muzzle trembling as he sighted at the door. "I don't know what the fuck you are," he gritted out through clenched teeth, "but you picked the wrong cabin to mess with." As if in answer, the thing outside let loose another bone-shaking roar, slamming against the door with enough force to splinter the thick oak. In the fractured moonlight spilling through the cracks, I caught a glimpse of a massive taloned paw. The claws wickedly curved and stained a rusting brown that could only be old blood. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as Ezra's finger tightened on the trigger, the sharp report of the rifle like a thunderclap in the close confines of the cabin. The thing howled, an ear-splitting shriek of pain and fury, but the thudding didn't cease. If anything, it redoubled, the door frame starting to buckle under the onslaught. Ezra cursed, fumbling to reload as I brandished my makeshift weapon with shaking hands. It was becoming horribly clear that we were outmatched here, hopelessly out of our depth against a foe that defied the very laws of nature. Just as I was bracing myself for the inevitable, For the moment when those claws would tear through our feeble barricade like tissue paper, the attack abruptly ceased. The sudden silence was almost more terrifying than the cacophony that had preceded it. Ezra and I stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe as we strained our ears for any hint of our assailant. Long, tense minutes ticked by, marked only by the ragged sawing of our breath and the rapid thud of our heartbeats. When the quiet remained unbroken, Ezra lowered the rifle fractionally, turning to me with a shell-shocked expression. Did it give up? I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak past the fear still clogging my throat. Every instinct was screaming that this was far from over, that the thing out there was just biding its time, waiting for us to let our guard down. A glimmer of movement beyond the window snapped my head around, my heart leaping into my throat. For a moment I could make out nothing in the darkness. Then a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom of the forest, a massive, hunched shape lumbering into the clearing surrounding the cabin. My breath caught in my chest as the creature straightened to its full height, easily topping 7 feet. In the watery moonlight I could make out more details I wished with all my being I could forget. The thing was shaped like a man, but its proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, legs too short, the torso bulging with slabs of muscle that strained against the shaggy pelt. Its face was a horror, a twisted amalgam of human and animal features. A blunt muzzle projected over a lipless mouth bristling with jagged teeth, each one as long as my thumb. But worst of all were the eyes, a sickly, intelligent yellow that glowed with a feral, all-too-aware light. For a heart-stopping moment those eyes met mine through the shattered window, and I swear I saw something like dark amusement flicker in their depths, a cruel recognition of the terror it had inspired. Then, with a fluid grace belying its bulk, the creature turned and melted back into the forest, the darkness swallowing it up like it had never been. In the ringing silence that followed, Ezra and I could only stare at each other, the rifle hanging forgotten in his numb fingers. There was no doubt, no rationalization that could explain away what we had just witnessed. We had come face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something straight out of... In the ringing silence that followed, Ezra and I could only stare at each other, the rifle hanging forgotten in his numb fingers. There was no doubt, no rationalization that could explain away what we had just witnessed. We had come face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something straight out of humanity's most primal nightmares, and it had marked us as its prey. "We need to get out of here," Ezra croaked, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the oppressive quiet. "Now, before that thing comes back." I nodded jerkily, my mind already racing ahead to the logistics of our escape. The truck was our only lifeline, our sole means of getting out of these God-forsaken woods and back to the safety of civilization. But to reach it, we'd have to venture out into the night, into the domain of the creature that had nearly shattered our sanity with a single glance. "We can't go now," I said, hating the tremor in my voice. "Not in the dark. We wouldn't make it 10 feet before that thing was on us." Ezra opened his mouth to argue, but the words died on his lips as the reality of our situation sank in. Out there, we were vulnerable, easy pickings for a predator that had already demonstrated its unnatural cunning and strength. In here, at least we had the illusion of shelter, the comforting solidity of walls and locked doors between us and the nightmare made flesh. "At first light, then," he said grimly, "we pack only what we need and we make a run for it. Don't stop for anything." The hours until dawn were the longest of my life. Ezra and I took turns on watch, the rifle clutched white-knuckled in shaking hands as we peered into the void beyond the shattered window. The darkness pressed in like a living thing, every rustle of leaves, every sigh of the wind setting our nerves strumming like live wires. There was no sign of the creature, no hint of glowing eyes or shaggy bulk moving among the trees. But that almost made it worse. The thing was out there, biding its time, playing with us like a cat toying with cornered mice. For an insane moment I almost wished it would attack again, anything to break the suffocating tension. When the first pale fingers of dawn began to creep across the sky, it felt like a benediction, a stay of execution. Hardly daring to breathe, Ezra and I gathered our meager supplies, every sense straining for the slightest hint of our tormentor's return. But the woods remained silent, still, mocking our terror with their placid serenity. It wasn't until we had the cabin door open, the truck keys clutched in Ezra's white-knuckled grip, that the facade shattered. A roar split the morning air, a sound of such fury and malevolence that it knocked the breath from my lungs. Ezra's head whipped towards the tree line, his eyes going wide with horror. I followed his gaze just in time to see the creature burst from the underbrush, its massive form hurtling towards us with terrifying speed. "Run!" Ezra screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Run!" We sprinted for the truck, hurling ourselves into the cab just as the creature reached the edge of the clearing. I caught a glimpse of its face, twisted with a rage that was all too human, before Ezra slammed the truck into gear and we were off, wheels spinning in the loose dirt. In the rearview mirror, I watched as the creature gave chase, its powerful legs eating up the ground in great loping strides. For one heart-stopping moment, I was certain it would catch us, that those wicked claws would hook into the tailgate and drag us back into a nightmare from which there would be no waking. But then we hit the main road, and Ezra floored it, the truck's engine roaring as we sped away from that place of horror. I risked one last glance back, just in time to see the creature skid to a halt at the tree line. It stood there for a long moment, its chest heaving, those hellish yellow eyes boring into mine with an intensity that promised this was far from over. Then, with a final vengeful howl, it turned and vanished back into the forest depths that had spawned it. The drive back to civilization was a blur, a numb haze of adrenaline and disbelief. Ezra and I barely spoke, each lost in the impossible memories of what we had witnessed. It wasn't until we stumbled into the ranger station, babbling some half-coherent story about a bear attack, that the enormity of it all came crashing down. The rangers were dubious, their eyes flickering skeptically over our wild-eyed, haunted expressions. But they couldn't deny the claw marks gouged into the truck's bodywork or the blood, not ours, we knew, that stained the windows. In the end, they chalked it up to a close encounter with a rogue grizzly, a tragic but explainable event. If only it were that simple. If only we could file away the events of that night as just another campfire story, a cautionary tale for the inexperienced hiker. But Ezra and I knew better. We had seen the face of something ancient and malevolent, something that defied the neat little boxes of science and reason. In the weeks and months that followed, we tried to put it behind us, to lose ourselves in the comforting banality of work and city life. But the memory lingered, an insidious poison that colored our every waking moment and lurked in the shadows of our dreams. Ezra took to the bottle, seeking solace in the numbing embrace of cheap whiskey. I threw myself into my job, working double shifts until exhaustion granted me a few precious hours of dreamless sleep. But always the creature was there, lurking on the edges of our consciousness. A flash of yellow eyes in a crowded street, a hulking shadow glimpsed from the corner of the eye. It had marked us, claimed us in some primal way we could never fully understand or escape. And as the years stretched on, the stories began to trickle in. Hushed whispers of hikers vanishing without a trace, of mangled animal carcasses found deep within the forest, of eerie howls echoing through the night. Each tale was like a knife to the gut, a reminder that our nightmare was all too real. I never went back to the Adirondacks, never set foot in another wilderness without the cold grip of fear tightening around my heart. The great outdoors, once a source of solace and wonder, had become a place of dread, a realm ruled by an apex predator that walked the gossamer line between myth and reality. But even in the neon-soaked canyons of the city, I can't escape the feeling that it's out there, watching, waiting, that one day, whether by chance or design, I'll round a corner and find myself staring into those pitiless yellow eyes once more. Because in the end, there are some horrors that can never be outrun, some scars that etch themselves onto the very soul. The wilderness may have taken everything else from me, my peace of mind, my sense of the world as a rational, orderly place. But it also gave me a terrible gift, a knowledge that can never be unlearned. Out there in the vast, untamed reaches of the world, monsters are real, and God help any man unfortunate enough to cross their path. The sun was setting, painting the New Mexico sky in vivid shades of orange and red. The desert stretched out before us, an endless sea of red dust and scrubby vegetation, broken only by the distant silhouettes of mountains that never seemed to get any closer no matter how long we drove. I was half asleep in the passenger seat of Caleb's beat-up old SUV, lulled by the monotonous rumble of the engine and the warmth of the fading sunlight on my face. We'd been on the road for hours, just like every other day of this aimless post-college road trip that had somehow stretched from a summer whim into a way of life. Not that there had been any college for either of us. Caleb had grown up on his family's farm in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, and had never seen much point in higher education when there was always work to be done on the land. As for me, well, that's a story for another time. Let's just say my roots are a tangled mess I try not to dwell on too much. We'd met a couple of years back, two drifters working odd jobs to keep gas in the tank and food in our bellies. Caleb was the kind of guy who could make friends with a rock, always ready with a grin and a helping hand, even for a scruffy, closed-off type like me. Somewhere along the line, we'd fallen into an easy companionship, the kind that doesn't ask too many questions. And so when the leaves began to turn and the nights grew colder, it had seemed only natural to point the SUV south, chasing the promise of warmth and adventure. We'd picked up work where we could, apple picking in Oregon, a stint on a fishing boat in California, even a couple of weeks on an oil rig in Texas. But mostly we just drove, letting the road take us where it would. On this particular day, we were headed for some national park Caleb had read about, a place of towering rock formations and ancient petroglyphs hidden in the desert. The name escapes me now, lost in the haze of events that followed. What I do remember is the moment Caleb spotted that weathered old sign. Masonic Springs, he read aloud, his voice taking on that slightly dreamy quality it always did when he sensed something mystical in the air. Sounds intriguing. What do you say we take a little detour, Everin? I cracked an eye open, taking in the narrow dirt road that branched off from the highway, winding into a landscape that looked like it hadn't changed since the dawn of time. I don't know, man, I said, heaving myself up straighter in my seat. We're not exactly equipped for off-roading. What if we get stuck out there? But Caleb just grinned, that irrepressible spark of mischief dancing in his eyes. Where's your sense of adventure? Come on, it'll be fun. And who knows, maybe we'll stumble across some ancient secrets or something. I should have argued more, should have insisted we stick to the plan, to the safety of the known road. But there was something in Caleb's enthusiasm that was hard to resist, a kind of infectious joy in the unknown. And if I'm being honest, there was a part of me that wanted to believe in his vision of the world, a place where every dirt track held the promise of magic and revelation. So, with a shrug and a half-hearted grumble, I settled back into my seat as Caleb turned the wheel, sending us bouncing and jostling down the narrow, winding path. Little did I know that in that moment, with that simple acquiescence, I had sealed our fates. That dirt road was leading us straight into the heart of a nightmare from which there would be no easy escape. But in the golden light of that fading New Mexico afternoon, with the wind whipping through the open windows and Caleb singing along to some half-forgotten country tune on the radio, it was easy to believe that the road would go on forever, that nothing truly bad could touch us out here in the vast expanse of the American West. Oh, how wrong I was. If only I had known then what horrors lay in wait, lurking in the lengthening shadows of the desert. If only I had heeded that tiny, nagging voice of caution that whispered at the back of my mind as the highway receded in the rearview mirror and the untamed wilderness closed in around us. But I was young and foolish and drunk on the heady elixir of freedom, and so I let the road carry us forward, deeper and deeper into the uncharted territory of fate and circumstance, until it was far too late to turn back. The sun was just kissing the horizon, painting the desert in shades of fiery orange and deep purple when I first saw the buildings. At first I thought they were just another trick of the light, shimmering mirages conjured by the heat-addled air. But as we bumped and jolted along the dirt track, they solidified into squat, weathered structures, their adobe walls half sunken into the parched earth. Whoa, stop, I said, straightening up in my seat as I peered through the dust-caked windshield. Do you see that? Caleb brought the SUV to a lurching halt, leaning forward to get a better look. There was a knowing glint in his eye, a hint of that same spiritualist zeal that had led us down this God-forsaken road in the first place. "Looks like some kind of old settlement," he said, his voice hushed with something like reverence. "Maybe even ruins from the Spanish colonial days. Can you imagine the history here, the stories these walls could tell?" I could, and that was the problem. There was something about the scene before us, the way the building seemed to hunch into the earth, the eerie stillness that hung over the place like a shroud, that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the kind of stillness that only exists in places long abandoned by the living, places where the veil between worlds grows thin and tattered. But Caleb was already opening his door, his long legs unfolding from the driver's seat with a creak of denim and a stretch of muscles too long confined. "Come on," he said, flashing me that grin that always made me want to follow him, no matter how foolhardy the venture. "Let's go check it out." Against my better judgment, I found myself trailing after him, the SUV's door slamming shut behind me with a sound that echoed across the empty expanse of the desert. The sun was dipping lower now, its dying rays painting the adobe walls in shades of blood and shadow. The air had taken on a chill, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you'll never be warm again. We picked our way through the rubble and the drifts of red dust towards the nearest of the structures. Up close I could see the rough, hand-hewn nature of the walls, the way the adobe had cracked and crumbled under the relentless assault of wind and sand and time. My fingers traced the weathered surface, feeling the grit of it, the dry, leached texture that spoke of centuries baking under the merciless sun. And then I saw the symbols. They were carved into the lintel of what must have once been a doorway, rough-hewn and crudely rendered, but unmistakable in their intent. I didn't recognize them, but they radiated a sense of power, of some ancient and unknowable purpose. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to turn tail, to flee back to the relative safety of the SUV and the open road. But Caleb was already ducking through the low entry, his form swallowed up by the darkness within. "Come on, Everin," he called, his voice muffled and strangely flat in the dead air. "You've got to see this." I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to run, to leave this place and its aura of ancient menace far behind. But in the end, the pull of Caleb's enthusiasm, the need to not be the one to break the spell of our shared adventure, won out over caution. With a deep breath and a muttered curse, I stepped over the threshold and into the waiting shadows. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, laden with the scent of dust and something else, something rank and feral that caught at the back of my throat. It was dark, the only light filtering in through chinks and gaps in the crumbling walls, but as my eyes adjusted I could make out the vague shape of the room, the uneven dirt floor and the sagging beams of the ceiling. And then I saw the eyes. They glowed in the deepest shadows, a sickly, luminous orange that seemed to pulse with a malevolent inner fire. At first I thought they were embers, some trick of the fading light, but then they moved, and I heard the soft shuffle of something large and heavy shifting in the darkness. "Caleb," I whispered, my voice cracking with sudden icy fear. "Caleb, there's something in here." But Caleb wasn't listening. He was moving towards those terrible glowing eyes, his hand outstretched as if in supplication, his face a mask of rapturous wonder. "Caleb, no!" I hissed, lunging forward to grab his arm. But it was too late. The thing in the shadows moved, faster than my eye could follow, and suddenly it was there, looming over us like a nightmare made flesh. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, with a hulking, misshapen form that seemed to blur and shift at the edges, as if it were not quite solid. Its body was covered in matted fur, a dark, oily pelt that glistened wetly in the half-light. But it was the head that froze the blood in my veins, that sent a scream bubbling up in my throat. It was elongated, almost canine, but with a wrong, twisted aspect that spoke of something far more sinister than any wolf or coyote. The muzzle was too long, the teeth too sharp and too numerous, jutting at odd angles from blackened gums. And the eyes, those terrible, glowing eyes, they burned with a feral, predatory hunger that seemed to strip the soul bare. I stood there, paralyzed with terror, as the thing took a step forward, its claws scraping against the packed earth of the floor. A low, guttural growl rumbled up from its chest, a sound that vibrated in my bones, that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. And then, as if a spell had been broken, Caleb screamed. It was a sound I will never forget, a high, piercing wail of pure, primal fear. The thing lunged, its jaws snapping shut with a sickening crunch, and suddenly the air was filled with the coppery scent of blood. I don't remember running. I don't remember clawing my way back through the doorway, out into the dying light of the desert evening. All I remember is the blind animal panic, the need to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that hulking, furred horror. I ran, stumbling and sliding in the loose sand, my lungs burning and my heart slamming against my ribs. Behind me I could hear the thing giving chase, its heavy tread shaking the earth, its ragged breathing hot on the back of my neck. I had a vague impression of Caleb shouting something, his voice high and thready with pain and fear, but I couldn't make out the words over the thundering of my own pulse in my ears. All I knew was that I had to keep running, had to find some way to escape the nightmare that had overtaken us. And then by some miracle I saw it, the mouth of a low cave, half hidden behind a tumble of boulders, a black gash in the red rock of the desert. I didn't hesitate, didn't stop to think. I just threw myself forward, scrabbling on hands and knees over the rough stone, plunging headlong into the cool, musty darkness. I heard Caleb cry out behind me, a sound that was abruptly cut off by a wet, meaty thud. I felt hot tears streaming down my face, blurring my vision, but I didn't dare stop. I just kept crawling, dragging myself deeper and deeper into the narrow, winding passage. And then, just as I felt the fetid breath of the thing on my heels, just as I braced myself for the searing pain of teeth and claws, my hand found empty air. I tumbled forward, falling through a narrow crevice and out into a tangle of thorny scrub and red dust on the other side. For a moment I just lay there, gasping and shaking, waiting for the end. But it didn't come. The thing, whatever it was, must have been too large to follow me through that final narrow gap. I heard it snarling and scrabbling at the rock, its frustrated howls echoing off the canyon walls. But I was safe, at least for the moment. I don't know how long I lay there, my face pressed into the gritty earth, my body racked with silent sobs. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to have lost all meaning, swallowed up in the enormity of the horror I had just witnessed. But eventually, as the last of the light faded from the sky and the stars began to wheel overhead, I dragged myself to my feet. I was still shaking, my mind reeling as it tried to process the impossible events of the last few hours. But beneath the shock and the grief, a new emotion was rising up in me, cold and implacable as steel. Anger, rage at the thing that had taken Caleb, that had shattered the fragile peace of our aimless wanderings, and beneath that, a grim, stubborn determination. I would survive this. I would find a way to go on, to carry the memory of Caleb with me like a talisman against the darkness. I staggered through the night, following the faint gleam of starlight reflected off the SUV's windshield. It was a miracle I found it at all, a tiny island of normalcy in the vast, pitiless sea of the desert. But find it I did, and with trembling hands I wrenched open the door and flung myself inside. The keys were still in the ignition, a small mercy. I turned them with numb fingers, feeling a wash of relief as the engine coughed to life. And then I was driving, the tires spraying gravel and sand as I pointed the nose of the SUV back towards the highway, back towards the thin veneer of civilization that suddenly seemed so fragile, so infinitely precious. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't have a plan or a destination. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to put as much distance as possible between myself and the nightmare I had left behind in the desert. And so I drove through the night and into the pale, tentative dawn, the events of the past few hours playing over and over in my mind like a horror movie stuck on repeat. I couldn't shake the image of those glowing orange eyes, the rank, fetid stench of the thing's breath, the sound of Caleb's final, desperate scream. It was a wound that would never fully heal, a scar on my psyche that would throb and ache for the rest of my days. But as the miles fell away beneath my wheels and the desert gave way to the first hints of human habitation, I made a silent vow to myself. I would find a way to go on. I would carry Caleb's memory with me, a bright, shining light to ward off the shadows that lurked at the edges of my consciousness. and someday somehow I would find a way to make sense of the horror that had overtaken us, to give meaning to the sacrifice my friend had made. Little did I know then just how long and twisted that path would be, or how deep into the darkness it would lead me. But in that moment, with the sun rising over the horizon and the open road stretching out before me, I felt the first stirrings of a grim, implacable purpose. I would survive, I would remember, and I would never ever stop searching for the truth behind the nightmare that had claimed Caleb's life. No matter how long it took, or how far I had to go, I would find a way to bring some light to the shadows that had swallowed him whole. It was a promise I made to myself, there in the pale light of that desert dawn, a promise that would shape the course of my life for years to come, leading me down paths I could never have imagined in my wildest dreams or darkest nightmares. But that is a story for another time. For now, it is enough to know that I survived, that I found a way to carry on in the face of the unspeakable, and that somewhere out there, in the vast, uncharted expanses of the American West, the thing that took Caleb is still lurking, waiting for its next unwary prey. May God have mercy on anyone unlucky enough to cross its path, because I know with a bone-deep certainty that it will show none. And that knowledge, that grim acceptance of the darkness that walks among us, is the burden I will carry with me for the rest of my days. The days that followed my escape from that desert nightmare were a blur of pain and paranoia. I drove until the SUV ran out of gas, then hitched rides with truckers and drifters, always looking over my shoulder, always expecting to see those glowing orange eyes staring out at me from the darkness. I didn't have a destination in mind. I was running on pure instinct, a primal need to put as much distance as possible between myself and the horror I had left behind. But eventually, as the miles fell away and the adrenaline faded, I found myself drifting towards the small towns and truck stops that dot the highways of the American West. It was in one of these places, a little diner clinging to the edge of a dusty Nevada town, that I first met Elias. I had been there for a few weeks, working odd jobs in the kitchen and trying to lose myself in the monotony of the daily grind. But even there, in the harsh fluorescent light and the chatter of the regulars, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of some dark presence lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I was bussing tables one evening when he walked in, a tall, weather-beaten man with a quiet intensity about him. He had the look of someone who had seen things, who had stared into the abyss and come out the other side. He ordered a coffee, black, and settled into a booth in the corner, his eyes scanning the room with a practiced, wary gaze. I don't know what it was that drew me to him. Maybe it was the recognition of a kindred spirit, someone else who had brushed up against the unknown and been forever changed by it. Or maybe it was just desperation, a need to unburden myself of the weight of my experiences to someone, anyone who might understand. Whatever the reason, I found myself drifting over to his table, coffee pot in hand. "Refill?" I asked, my voice sounding thin and reedy to my own ears. He looked up at me, his eyes a piercing blue under the brim of his battered cowboy hat. For a long moment he just studied me, as if he could see straight through to the haunted, broken places inside. Then he nodded, pushing his mug towards me. "Much obliged," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You look like you've got a story to tell, kid." I don't know what made me trust him. Maybe it was the understanding in his eyes, the sense that he had walked the same dark paths that I had. Or maybe I was just so desperate for someone to believe me, to validate the horror of what I had experienced, that I would have poured my heart out to anyone who showed the slightest interest. Whatever the reason, I found myself sliding into the booth across from him, the words spilling out of me in a rush. I told him everything, from the aimless wanderings that had brought Caleb and me to that fateful crossroads, to the nightmare creature in the ruins and the desperate, terrifying flight that had followed. Through it all, he listened in silence, his eyes never leaving my face. When I finally ran out of words, he leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "Skinwalker," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's what you saw out there, kid. A creature of pure evil, born of ancient magic and dark rituals." I felt a chill run down my spine at the word. I had heard whispers of skinwalkers before, half-remembered stories from my childhood. tales of shape-shifting witches who could take on the form of animals. But I had always dismissed them as mere folklore, the superstitions of a primitive, pre-scientific age. Now, with the memory of those glowing orange eyes still seared into my mind, I wasn't so sure. "You've seen them before," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Haven't you?" Elias nodded, his gaze distant. "More times than I care to remember," he said. "I've been hunting them for years, ever since one of them took someone I loved. It's a hard road, kid, and a lonely one. But it's the only way to keep others safe, to stop these things before they can claim more innocent lives." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a kind of grim understanding. "I can see it in you," he said softly. "The same thing that drives me. The need for answers, for vengeance. The willingness to stare into the darkness, no matter the cost to your own soul." I felt a lump rise in my throat, a sudden overwhelming surge of emotion. Here at last was someone who understood, who had walked the same path of grief and obsession. "Teach me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Teach me how to hunt them, how to stop them. I can't let what happened to Caleb happen to anyone else." Elias studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he nodded. "It won't be easy," he warned. "This life, it takes a toll. On your mind, your body, your very soul. You'll see things that will haunt you, that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the world. But if you're sure, if you're willing to walk this path, I'll show you what I know." And so began my apprenticeship, my long, slow descent into the shadow world that exists just beyond the edges of our own. Elias taught me everything he knew, from the ancient lore of the skinwalkers to the practical skills of tracking and combat. We traveled the back roads and byways of the West, following the trail of strange sightings and unsolved disappearances, always searching for any sign of the creature that had taken Caleb. It was a hard life, a lonely life. We spent long weeks camping in the wilderness, subsisting on whatever we could hunt or scavenge. We faced danger at every turn, not just from the skinwalkers themselves, but from the harsh realities of life on the fringes of society. But through it all, I found a kind of grim purpose, a sense of meaning that had been missing from my life since that fateful night in the desert. I was a hunter now, a guardian of the innocent, a lone light shining in the darkness. And though the road was long and the shadows deep, I knew that I would never turn back, never rest until I had found a way to bring justice to the memory of my lost friend. Years passed and the trail grew colder, but still we pressed on, driven by a stubborn, unyielding determination. And then, one night, as we camped under the stars in the high desert of New Mexico, we heard it. A howl, long and mournful, echoing off the canyon walls. A sound that I knew with a bone-deep certainty belonged to the creature that had haunted my dreams for so long. We tracked it for days, following the faint, elusive signs of its passage. And then, finally, we found it. It was holed up in a cave in the heart of the desert, a place of ancient, primal darkness. We approached with caution, our weapons at the ready, our hearts pounding in our chests. The battle that followed was fierce and desperate, a primal struggle for survival against a creature of pure, malevolent evil. In the end, we emerged victorious, the skinwalker's lifeless body lying at our feet, its orange eyes staring sightlessly at the desert sky. But the victory was hard-won, and not without cost. Elias was badly wounded, his body broken by the creature's savage claws. As I knelt beside him, cradling his head in my lap, he looked up at me with a faint, pained smile. "You did good, kid," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. "You did real good. But this fight, it's not over. There's always another one out there, always another shadow to chase. Promise me you'll keep going, keep fighting. For Caleb, for all the ones we couldn't save." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I promise," I said, my voice choked with emotion. "I won't stop, not until my last breath. I'll keep the light shining no matter how dark the night gets." Elias smiled, a last faint flicker of life in his fading eyes. And then he was gone, his body growing still and cold in my arms. I buried him there, in the heart of the desert he had loved so well. And then I set out alone, my heart heavy with grief, but my resolve unshaken. I was a hunter now, a guardian of the innocent, a lone light shining in the darkness. And though the road ahead was long and the shadows deep, I knew that I would never turn back, never rest until I had fulfilled the promise I had made to my friend and mentor. And so I wander still, following the rumors and whispers, always searching for signs of the skinwalkers and their dark, twisted magic. It's a hard life, a lonely life, but it's the only one I know, the only one that gives meaning to the pain and loss I have endured. Sometimes in the long, cold nights I think of Caleb, of the laughter and the light that was snuffed out so cruelly in the desert all those years ago. And I think of Elias, of the grim, unyielding determination that drove him, of the sacrifices he made to keep the innocent safe from the horrors that lurk in the shadows. They are my guiding stars, my constant companions on this long, lonely road. And though I know that I may never find peace, never be free of the burden I have taken on, I also know that I will never stop fighting, never stop searching for the light in the darkness. For I am a hunter, a guardian, a lone warrior standing against the tide of evil that threatens to engulf us all. And as long as there is breath in my body and fire in my heart, I will never ever give up the fight. The 11th of June, 1955. There I was, trekking through the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico. Some folks head to the beach for vacation, but not me. I always head for the hills, a sucker for a good trail. The crunch of gravel under my boots, the smell of pine needles sharp in my nose. Nothing beats it. This time, though, the trail took a turn I wasn't expecting. A turn that still makes my gut clench when I think about it, even all these years later. It was day 3 of my solo hike. The sun was beating down like a hammer on an anvil, and I was sweating like a sinner in church, but the scenery made it all worthwhile. Towering ponderosa pines stretched into the clear blue sky. The occasional flash of a blue jay caught my eye, and the distant rumble of a waterfall provided a soothing soundtrack. It was just me, Mother Nature, and a granola bar that tasted like cardboard. Life was good. And then I saw it. Lying smack in the middle of the trail like someone had dropped it from the sky, a backpack, and a fancy one at that, all high-tech nylon and shiny buckles. It looked brand spanking new. I figured some city slicker had overestimated their wilderness skills and dumped their gear to lighten their load. Cautiously, I poked the pack with the toe of my boot. No response. I unzipped a pocket and found a wallet inside. Driver's license, credit cards, the works. The name on the ID read Stanley Burdock. Poor bastard probably wouldn't make it far without his supplies. With a sigh, I slung the heavy pack over my shoulder, adding a good 10 pounds to my load. But hey, good karma, right? I'd drop it off at the ranger station when I got back to civilization. No skin off my back. Oh, how naive I was. A couple hours later, I came across something else unexpected. A campsite tucked away under a cluster of Douglas firs. The tent was ripped to shreds, the sleeping bag torn open like a gutted fish. And there, lying next to the cold remnants of a campfire, was Stanley Burdock. Or what was left of him anyway. I'd never seen anything like it. Half his face was just gone, like something had taken a massive bite out of a ripe watermelon. His clothes were in tatters, limbs twisted at sickening, unnatural angles. The stench of decay hung heavy in the air. I didn't stick around to examine the gory details. I just turned, threw up the meager contents of my stomach, and hightailed it out of there as fast as my trembling legs could carry me. I ran until my lungs burned and my muscles screamed for mercy. Finally collapsing by a gurgling stream, I gasped for breath, my heart threatening to hammer right out of my heaving chest. What the hell had happened to that poor guy? A bear attack? A mountain lion? Or something far worse that my mind shied away from contemplating? I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Burdock's mangled face, that garish wound gaping like a second screaming mouth. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig had me jumping like a scared rabbit, clutching my hunting knife with white knuckles. I've never been so glad to see the sun rise. By the time dawn broke, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, I was an exhausted, jittery wreck. I decided then and there to cut my trip short and hike back to the ranger station as quickly as my weary legs could manage. The return trek felt twice as long as the hike in. Every shifting shadow morphed into a hulking, bloodthirsty beast. Every whisper of wind carried the echo of an agonized scream. My imagination ran wild with dark possibilities. When the rustic ranger station finally came into view, I could have wept with relief. I practically kissed the sun-baked earth. So glad was I to return to some shred of civilization and sanity. The ranger on duty, a grizzled old-timer by the name of Bill, listened to my frantic tale with a stony expression that could have been carved from the faces of the surrounding cliffs. "We've had reports of missing hikers," he said, his voice gravelly from years of barking orders and breathing campfire smoke. "Search parties haven't found a goddamn thing." He took Burdock's wallet from my shaking hands, fixing me with a piercing stare. "You sure you didn't see anything else out there, son? Hear anything unusual?" "Just something moving in the bushes," I lied, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. In truth, I thought I had glimpsed a flash of matted fur, the curve of a wicked claw. But I didn't want to sound like some raving lunatic spouting tall tales of monsters lurking in the woods. I was rattled enough as it was. Ranger Bill just nodded slowly, his weathered face unreadable. "You best stay put. I've radioed the sheriff. She'll be wanting a word with you." The sheriff, as it turned out, was a young woman by the name of Deputy Ramona Garza. Sharp eyes, sharper mind, and a tongue that could cut glass. She grilled me for the better part of an hour, her pen scratching across a battered notepad as I recounted my story for the umpteenth time. When I got to the part about the shredded campsite and Burdock's mutilated body, I thought I saw a flicker of something, fear perhaps, dart across her chiseled features, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a mask of cool professionalism. "We'll take it from here," she said briskly, snapping her notebook shut with an air of finality. "The body will be retrieved and examined. In the meantime, I suggest you head on home, Mr. YN, and maybe stick to city parks and greenways for a while, yeah? The wilderness isn't always as idyllic as it seems." I wanted to protest, to tell her about the icy dread that still lurked in my gut, the certainty that something out there was watching, waiting, that Burdock's death was no freak animal attack. But I bit my tongue, just nodded meekly and mumbled my thanks. I knew when I was being politely dismissed, and frankly I was only too happy to oblige. I made the long drive back to the city in a daze, Burdock's blood-splattered face and Garza's warning echoing through my mind. At home I tried to settle back into my old routine, the 9-to-5 grind, microwave dinners, too much whiskey and not enough sleep. But I couldn't shake the sense that something fundamental had shifted. A dark veil lifted to reveal the savage teeth of an uncaring universe. The familiar rhythms of my life felt hollow, flimsy camouflage stretched over an inky, primal void. The nightmares began almost immediately. Night after night I bolted awake in a cold sweat, fragments of disturbing dreams still clinging to my consciousness like cobwebs. Trees with grasping claw-tipped branches, hulking shadows crashing through the underbrush, a wet, ripping sound and a gurgling scream. And always, that oppressive sense of being stalked by an ancient, ravenous gaze. After a week of increasingly sleepless nights and coffee-fueled days, I hit a breaking point. I couldn't keep going like this, jumping at every creak of the floorboards and flinching from my own shadow. I needed answers, needed to make sense of the insensible, and I knew just where to start looking. Steeling my nerves with a generous slug of bourbon, I upended Burdock's backpack on my kitchen table. Most of it was standard hiking fare. Dehydrated rations, a basic first aid kit, water purification tablets, a compass. But buried at the very bottom, wedged between a rumpled slicker and an extra pair of socks, I found a small, leather-bound journal. Hands trembling slightly, I cracked it open and began to read. The first few pages contained mundane notes about trail conditions and wildlife sightings, Burdock's tight, spidery handwriting marching across the weathered pages in orderly lines. But as I delved deeper, the entries grew darker, more disturbed. "Something's out there," he'd written, the words slanting drunkenly across the page. "Watching me. I hear it at night, moving in the trees, catch glimpses of its eyes reflecting the moonlight. It's not a bear, not a cougar, something else, something wrong." The next entry chilled me to the bone. "It's getting closer. Can smell it sometimes on the breeze, a fetid reek of decay and damp fur, like death itself gone feral. Woke to find clawed footprints circling my tent. I'm being hunted. May God have mercy on my soul. The final entry was just 2 words scrawled in a shaking hand. It's here. I slammed the journal shut, pulse pounding in my ears. There was no denying it now. The thing that had stalked Burdock, savaged him, and left him as a macabre warning. It was real, and it was still out there somewhere, prowling the Gila in search of new prey. A desperate, half-formed idea seized me and wouldn't let go. I had to go back, had to see for myself, get proof of the creature's existence. Maybe then I could find a way to stop it before it claimed any more innocent lives. It was madness, sheer suicidal folly. But I didn't care. I was a man possessed. I made my preparations with a grim sense of purpose. Bought myself a shiny new rifle, enough ammo to take down a rogue elephant. Studied topographical maps of the wilderness until I could trace the craggy contours of canyons and mesas in my sleep, and reached out to the one person who might just be desperate or crazy enough to join me on this ill-advised quest, Deputy Ramona Garza. Much to my surprise, she agreed to meet, and so, 2 weeks to the day since I'd first stumbled across Burdock's bloody remains, I found myself once again bumping down the dusty back roads of New Mexico. But this time I wasn't some hapless wanderer. I was a man with a mission, and heaven help any beast that tried to stand in my way. The sun was just starting its slow descent towards the serrated horizon when I pulled into the parking lot of a shabby roadside diner on the outskirts of Silver City. The flickering neon sign above the door read Cactus Jacks in sputtering green letters, half of them long since burnt out. I killed the engine and just sat for a moment, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel as I scanned the mostly deserted lot. A couple of beat-up pickup trucks, a rusty VW van that had seen better decades. No sign of Garza. I was just about to give up and head inside when a cloud of dust billowed up from the access road and a battered Jeep Cherokee came bouncing into view. It screeched to a halt a few spaces down from me, the driver's side door swinging open to reveal a familiar slight figure in a khaki uniform. Deputy Ramona Garza, right on time. She strode over to my car, one hand resting casually on the butt of her service pistol. Even in the fading light I could see the sharp angles of her face, the wary set of her dark eyes as she sized me up through the windshield. I popped the door and climbed out, hands held carefully away from my body. The last thing I needed was to spook her with any sudden moves. "Deputy Garza," I said, inclining my head in greeting. "Thanks for meeting me." She didn't return my smile, just gave a curt nod. "You said you had information about the Burdock case. I'm listening." I reached slowly into my jacket pocket and withdrew the dead man's journal, holding it out to her like a peace offering. "I found this in his backpack. I think you should read it." Garza took the battered little book, flipping it open and scanning a few pages with a deepening frown. When she looked up at me again, there was a new intensity in her gaze, a flicker of something I couldn't quite read. "This is disturbing," she said carefully, as if weighing each word. "If even half of what Burdock wrote is true, we could be dealing with a highly dangerous animal, possibly even a new species." I barked a humorless laugh. "I think we're a bit beyond cougars and bears here, Deputy. You read the same thing I did. This is no ordinary predator we're talking about." She closed the journal with a snap, her mouth set in a grim line. "Look, I'll admit there are some oddities about this case. The savagery of the attack, the lack of tracks or scat at the scene. But I'm a cop, not a cryptozoologist. I deal in facts, not flights of fancy." I took a step closer, holding her gaze without blinking. "Then come back out there with me. Help me track this thing, find the truth. You're the only one who's taken this seriously from the start. The only one I trust to watch my back. Please, Ramona, I need your help." For a long moment she just stared at me, searchlight eyes boring into mine like she could sift through the very contents of my soul. Then at last she gave a slow nod. "All right," she said, a hint of steel threading through her tone. "We'll do this your way, Mr. LN, but we do it smart, we do it careful. And if I say fall back, you damn well better listen. I'm not about to have your blood on my hands, you hear?" "Loud and clear," I said, trying not to let my relief show too plainly on my face. "So, when do we start?" She glanced over her shoulder at the sinking sun, the sky slowly purpling into dusk. First light tomorrow. I'll clear my schedule, take a few personal days. Meet me at the ranger station at dawn. And Mr. L.N., yeah? Bring that fancy new rifle of yours. Something tells me we're going to need it. And with that ominous pronouncement hanging in the air between us, she turned on her heel and stalked back to her jeep without so much as a backward glance. I watched her taillights disappear into the gathering dark, a queasy mix of anticipation and dread churning in my gut. Come hell or high water, I'd begun this hunt. Now all that remained was to see it through, to the bitter, bloody end. Morning came all too soon, the anemic light of dawn barely denting the gloaming shadows of the Gila. I was waiting at the ranger station when Garza pulled up in her jeep, clutching a thermos of strong black coffee like a holy relic. I'd barely slept a wink, too keyed up with nerves and morbid imaginings. From the pinched set of her features and the purple smudges under her eyes, I guessed the deputy hadn't fared much better. We set out with grim purpose, hiking in silence through the mist-wreathed trees. I led the way to Burdock's ravaged campsite, steeling myself for the grisly tableau I knew awaited us. But even the lurid embellishments of my nightmares hadn't prepared me for the sight of the scattered debris, the ripped and blood-stiffened tatters of the tent. Death hung heavy on the air, thick and cloying at the back of my throat. To her credit, Garza barely flinched. She moved methodically through the carnage, snapping photos, bagging samples with a clinical detachment I could only envy. "Whatever did this was big," she remarked, crouching to examine a ragged swatch of fabric. "And extremely powerful. Look at the force needed to rend this nylon." I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak around the hard lump of dread lodged in my chest. We picked up Burdock's trail leading deeper into the backcountry, noting the occasional splash of rusty brown on the leaves, a scrap of cloth snagged on a thorny branch. Then, maybe half a mile from the crime scene, we found the first print. It was like no animal track I'd ever seen, a deep gouge in the soft earth nearly 2 feet long. The splayed toes were tipped with viciously curved claws, the pad eerily human-like in its breadth and contours. Garza measured it against her own boot, a bleak smile twisting her lips. "Bigger than a grizzly," she said softly, an undercurrent of awe threaded through the words. "What the hell are we dealing with here?" I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I just didn't want to give voice to the primal fears swirling behind my eyes, nightmare visions of something ancient and obscene lurking in the primeval shadows of the world, something that had no name in any human tongue, but hungered nonetheless for our warm flesh and bright terror. We pressed on, following the grim trail ever deeper into the wilderness. The sense of being watched, of some malevolent presence dogging our every step, grew more oppressive with each passing mile. The very trees seemed to crowd closer, their gnarled branches grasping and clawing at our clothes. An unnatural hush lay over the forest, broken only by the occasional harsh cry of a crow, the scurrying of small creatures through the underbrush. By mid-afternoon we stumbled across another abandoned campsite, the scene eerily similar to Burdock's, shredded tent, scattered gear, dark stains soaked into the loam. A quick check of a discarded wallet confirmed my worst suspicions. The mauled remnants had once belonged to a young couple, avid hikers who'd been reported missing over a month ago. No bodies, but the gruesome detritus of frenzied violence told the tale well enough. Garza's face was grim, her knuckles white on the grip of her drawn sidearm. "This is no longer just an animal attack," she gritted out. "This is a goddamn killing spree, and we're walking right into the lion's den." I swallowed hard, my own fingers tightening convulsively around the stock of my rifle. But I couldn't turn back, not now, not when we were so close. The beast had to be stopped, no matter the cost. I owed that much to Burdock, to the nameless missing, to myself. And so we soldiered on, 2 lonely pinpricks of determined humanity in a vast, pitiless wilderness. The shadows lengthened, the light taking on the sepia tinge of old photographs. My every nerve was strung taut as piano wire, senses straining for any hint of movement, of threat. It was almost a relief when we finally found the den. The reek hit us first, a noxious miasma of putrefaction and musk so thick it coated the tongue. We followed our noses to a narrow ravine choked with scrubby brush, the bones of the earth rising sharply to either side. There, half concealed behind a jumble of moss-slick boulders, gaped a jagged fissure in the stone. A rank draft billowed from that dark maw, carrying with it the unmistakable sweet ripe stench of carrion. We exchanged a loaded glance, pulses beating in tandem. The lair of the beast. Garza unclipped a heavy-duty flashlight from her belt, thumb hovering over the switch. I chambered around in my Winchester, the oiled click unnaturally loud in that charged silence. Together we advanced on that waiting void, the very air seeming to thrum with a subliminal growl. My blood roared in my ears, fight or flight instinct screaming to turn tail and run, but I quelled it savagely, forced my leaden feet to keep plodding forward. There could be no turning back now, not with my sanity hanging by a thread and a savage killer still on the loose. Whatever awaited us in that Stygian abyss, I would meet it head-on. At the lip of the cave mouth, Garza paused, casting me a searching sideways look. "Last chance to back out," she said, and I couldn't tell if it was an offer or a challenge. "There's no shame in—" A bone-rattling roar exploded from the depths of the cavern, the sound slamming into us like a physical blow. Garza's flashlight beam stabbed wildly into the darkness, catching a glimpse of shaggy fur, the wet gleam of teeth and eyes. Then the thing was rushing towards us, a juggernaut of primal fury and rent flesh. Time seemed to slow, syrup thick and crystalline. I saw its massive head swing towards me, jaws dripping gobbets of gore. Saw Garza's pistol barking fire, bullets sparking off the rock walls. Felt the sear of pain as a swipe of scimitar claws opened my shoulder to the bone. I fell back, scrabbling for my rifle, some distant part of my brain marveling at how the wet crunch of the beast's teeth in my arm sounded so very similar to a man biting into a ripe apple. Then Garza was there, dragging me clear, shoving the gun into my bleeding hands. "Shoot, damn it," she screamed, desperation and terror cracking her voice. Operating on pure instinct, I brought the rifle to my shoulder, pointed it at the heaving bulk of the creature, drew a bead on that nightmare visage, the dripping ruin of its throat. Squeezed the trigger once, twice, the kick of the recoil jarring me to the core. The thing jerked and stumbled, dark ichor spraying, but kept coming, an avid hunger burning in its mindless gaze. I fired again, aiming for the malformed skull, the gory eye sockets. On the fifth shot, something finally broke behind those twin pits of hell. With a keening wail, the abomination folded in on itself and crashed to the blood-slick stone, twitching like a beetle on a pin. In the sudden ringing silence that followed, I could hear the rasp of Garza's breathing, the click of her gun's hammer as she kept it trained unwaveringly on the fallen behemoth. Slowly, painfully, I levered myself to my feet, clamping one shaking hand over the weeping ruin of my shoulder. Together we limped cautiously closer to the motionless bulk, the stink of its death washing over us in noxious waves. Dear God in heaven, I'd never seen anything like it. It was a perversion of all natural law, a twisted amalgamation of man and beast and some fouler, blacker thing. Easily 9 feet tall, with a barrel chest and grossly elongated limbs knotted with ropey muscle under its matted pelt. The head was misshapen, almost canine, trap-like jaws bristling with jagged teeth the length of hunting knives. Intelligence glittered in its glazed porcine eyes, a malign awareness utterly at odds with its animalistic form. But by far the most horrific thing was the tattered remnants of clothing still clinging to its grotesque frame, a plaid flannel shirt stretched to bursting around its massive torso, shredded denim encasing its backward-bending legs. The cruel mockery of a man's hiking boots, split at the seams by taloned paws. Bile scorched the back of my throat as the awful realization crashed over me. This wasn't just some feral creature, warped by injury or inbreeding to freakish proportions and unnatural appetites. No, this living nightmare had once been human, had walked and talked and thought as a man, before succumbing to the twisted hungers of the beast within. What unimaginable torment must Burdock have suffered in his final moments, as his body and mind were perverted into the very thing that he'd feared. I turned away, retching helplessly, dimly aware of Garza doing the same a few feet away. In that moment of agonized revelation, I knew with a bone-deep certainty that the scars we carried away from this day would run soul-deep, indelible, and unhealing, that no amount of distance or drink or denials could ever erase the image of that obscene, chittering thing wearing a man's skin like an ill-fitting costume. We burned the corpse where it lay, dousing it liberally with accelerant and setting it alight with hands that shook only slightly. As the greasy smoke spiraled into the uncaring sky, I saw a glimmer of something like understanding in Garza's haunted eyes, an echo of my own horrified epiphany. There were older and fouler things than wolves or wildcats prowling the untamed corners of the world, hungering for the warm blood and bright terror of mortal men. Things that had no place in a sane and rational universe, but clung tenaciously to the shadows nonetheless. The trip back to civilization was a blur, pain and shock and sickened revulsion blunting the edges of everything. We concocted a hasty story about a rabid bear, made all the necessary calls and reports, and if our voices shook as we repeated the lie over and over, who could blame us? There were some truths too terrible to be borne, some horrors too profane for the light of day. In the end, they closed off that cursed section of the Gila, posted warnings about animal attacks and unsafe hiking conditions. Life went on, the fickle eye of the world soon turning to fresher tragedies and brighter distractions. But for Deputy Garza and me, there was no moving on, no unseeing what we'd witnessed in that charnel cave. She eventually left the force, unable to endure the way every shadow and rustle in the night conjured visions of fang and claw. I retreated into a bottle, pickling my demons in whiskey fumes and chasing monsters to the bottom of each empty glass. And yet, even now, decades later and a lifetime removed from that red-soaked glade, I sometimes catch myself looking over my shoulder on moonless nights, searching the tree line for a shaggy silhouette, a brandished blade of shining teeth, wondering how many of the lost and the lonely have been dragged away to glut the unclean appetites of the dark. How many hikers and transients and drifters simply vanished into the hungry maw of the forest, never to be seen again. Because I know in my shriveled, weary heart that the thing that had once been Stanley Burdock wasn't the only one of its kind, that it was only a harbinger, a herald of horrors yet to come. The wild places of the world hold secrets older than stone, hungers more ancient than civilization itself, and heaven help the poor bastards unlucky enough to stumble across them unawares. The Wendigo walks, you see. It shambles through the lonely woods and forgotten hollows, dead eyes burning with the cold feral light of the stars. And it hungers, oh how it hungers, for the sweet marrow of innocence, the hot salt tang of mortal dread. It wears our skins and speaks with our stolen voices, vomits forth our undigested hopes and dreams in spatters of bile and gore. And it will never, ever stop. Not until the last whimpering cry fades to silence, the last skull is picked clean and gleaming, until all the world is its hunting ground and slaughterhouse, one endless charnel forest echoing with the screams of the damned and the dying, and I'll be waiting for it, sitting by my cache of bullets and bottles, a loaded gun cradled in my shaking hands, keeping my vigil through the long, cold nights, watching the tree line with feverish eyes, praying for the first twitch of movement, the first huff of fetid breath, because someone has to remember, to stand witness against the hungry dark, to light a feeble candle against the encroaching gloom and howl defiance with a throat gone raw from screaming. And who better than a damned old drunk with nothing left to lose and the stench of an atavistic evil forever seared into his mind? So here I sit, stewing in my own sweat and paranoia, bracing for a fight I know I can never win, waiting for the soft tread of twisted feet through the fallen leaves, the glint of an antler-crowned silhouette looming against the moon. Muttering a prayer to a god I no longer believe in, just 3 words repeated over and over like a drunkard's barroom chant. Come on, you son of a bitch. I'm ready for you. Come on. My name is Jacob Hernandez, and I'm a 35-year-old ex-park ranger haunted by memories that gnaw at my sanity like a festering wound. The events I'm about to recount took place in the once tranquil wilderness of the Adirondack Park back in August of 2000, but even now, 2 decades later, they remain seared into my mind with a vividness that still jolts me awake in a cold sweat most nights. Working as a ranger in those tangled green mountains had been my life's passion, the fulfillment of a boyhood dream to spend my days amidst nature's untamed splendor. I had fallen in love with the place, the mirror-still lakes reflecting the vast dome of sky, the ancient forests with their cathedral hush, even the occasional close encounter with the majestic wildlife. Sure, the job had its challenges, a marauding bear here, a lost hiker there, but nothing that the academy training and a cool head couldn't handle. Or so I had thought, with the naive confidence of a man who had not yet come face to face with the stuff of nightmares. It began, as most horror stories do, on a deceptively ordinary day, with no portent of the impending descent into a hell I could never have imagined. The radio crackled with a routine call. A family of 5, the Wallaces, had failed to check out of their backcountry cabin rental on schedule. Missing hikers were a common enough occurrence, and 9 times out of 10 it was simply a case of poor time management or a sprained ankle. My partner Ben and I set out to sweep their route, a gentle loop trail circumnavigating one of the park's more scenic lakes. We expected to find the Wallaces tired but sheepish, apologetic for the inconvenience. What awaited us at the trailhead, however, was the first chilling hint that something was amiss. The family's minivan sat forlornly in the gravel lot, conspicuously out of place amidst the towering pines. In the back, their golden retriever whined and pawed at the window, its distress an eerie echo of the unease already prickling up my own spine. Ben and I exchanged a look, some unspoken understanding passing between us. We'd been partners for years, an easy camaraderie born of shared experiences, and the peculiar bond of those tasked with maintaining the delicate balance between human recreation and the unforgiving wilderness. In that moment, I saw my own apprehension reflected back in the tightening of Ben's jaw, the slight hesitation before he unclipped his radio to call in the vehicle discovery. We fanned out to canvass the area, eyes scanning the dense undergrowth for any sign of the Wallaces. It was oppressively still under the forest canopy, even the ever-present birdsong oddly absent, as if the creatures of the wood sensed an unwelcome presence and had fallen warily silent. I pushed through a tangle of branches, boots sinking into the loamy earth, and then froze, heart leaping into my throat. There, half concealed beneath a drift of leaves, was a small, huddled form. For a moment I couldn't process what I was seeing, my mind refusing to acknowledge the tableau of horror. But as I dropped to my knees and reached out with trembling hands, the reality hit me like a punch to the gut. It was the youngest of the Wallace children, a girl no more than 7 or 8. Her face was ghost pale, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks. She clutched a stuffed rabbit, the toy's cheerful patterned fabric grotesquely at odds with the child's glassy, terrorized stare. I called out for Ben, my voice cracking with a mixture of relief at finding her alive and dread at the implications of her solitary state. Ben crashed through the brush, pulling up short when he saw us. His eyes met mine over the girl's head, and I saw the same sickening realization dawn. "Hey there, sweetheart," I said softly, trying to keep my tone soothing despite the hammering of my pulse. "We're park rangers. We're here to help. Can you tell us what happened? Where's the rest of your family?" At first there was nothing, just that blank, uncomprehending stare and the convulsive tightening of small fingers on the stuffed toy. Then, like a dam bursting, the words came pouring out, tumbling over each other in a hyperventilating rush. "The monster took them. In the trees, in the dark, it came and took them." Her voice dissolved into hiccuping sobs, thin shoulders heaving. Ben and I exchanged another loaded glance, a silent communication honed by years in the field together. Gently, I coaxed more details from her, piecing together a fragmented story of a family hike turned nightmare. They'd been walking the trail, she said, just a short loop before heading back to the cabin for lunch. Her brothers had been arguing over who got to throw the ball for the dog, their voices carrying through the crisp air. Her parents were walking ahead, hand in hand, talking softly and laughing. A normal scene, one that played out daily across the park's miles of interlocking trails. And then, in an instant, it had all shattered. A crashing noise in the underbrush, guttural and loud, a shadow detaching itself from the tree line, something huge and furred. Her mother's scream abruptly cut off, the sounds of a struggle, the thud of bodies, and then a terrible, reverberating silence, broken only by the child's own ragged breathing, as she huddled paralyzed under the sheltering arms of a fallen log. "It took them," she whispered again, a haunted refrain. "The monster in the woods, it took them." Ben was already radioing for backup, his tone clipped and urgent. I cradled the shivering girl against my chest, murmuring reassurances I didn't believe myself. Because even then, in the first shocked moments, some instinctive part of me knew this was no ordinary animal attack. The forest around us felt altered, sinister, like we were suddenly trespassers in our own territory. The size of the creature she described, the way it had snatched 4 adults away in mere moments, it defied any rational explanation. We waited there in the ominous hush of the woods, the girls' hitching breaths and the static crackle of the radio the only sounds. I strained my ears for the approach of help, of reinforcements to help make sense of the incomprehensible. But as the minutes dragged on with no sign of our backup, a dark understanding began to coalesce at the edges of my thoughts. We were on our own out here, in the heart of a vast wilderness that had always held its secrets close. And now one of those secrets had awoken hungry. When the search team finally arrived, it was anticlimactic. A dozen grim-faced rangers and volunteers fanned out in a grid pattern, meticulously combing the dense underbrush for any sign of the missing Wallaces. But as the hours dragged on and the light began to slant golden through the trees, an uneasy consensus solidified. There was no trace of the family, not a shred of torn clothing snagged on a branch or a single drop of blood to guide the way. It was as if they had been plucked cleanly from the face of the earth, leaving only their abandoned vehicle and their traumatized daughter as evidence they had ever existed at all. By the time we regrouped at the trailhead, defeated and bone-weary, the official narrative had already begun to take shape. A rogue bear, the higher-ups declared, a tragic but explainable event. The lack of evidence could be attributed to the dense foliage and the rugged terrain. The creature the girl described had been the product of a terrified imagination, her young mind reeling in the aftermath of an unspeakable loss. But even as the tidy statements were released to the press and the incident officially filed away, I knew the truth would not be so easily buried. The utter absence of any physical sign, the uncanny speed and stealth of the abduction, and above all, the stark instinctual terror in that little girl's eyes when she spoke of the monster. It pointed to something far more sinister at work. And though I couldn't yet put a name to the creeping dread that had lodged itself beneath my breastbone, I knew with grim certainty that this was only the beginning. The Wallace family had not been the first to vanish into the hungry maw of the forest, and they would not be the last. Something ancient and unspeakably evil had awoken in those shadowed glens, and heaven help any poor soul unlucky enough to cross its path. In the days following the disappearance of the Wallace family, a pall settled over the ranger station. We went through the motions of our duties, maintaining trails, assisting hikers, tagging the occasional nuisance bear for relocation. But there was an unspoken tension thrumming beneath the surface. The easy banter that had always filled the air during morning briefings and evening paperwork sessions had been replaced by a grim, watchful silence, punctuated only by the rustling of maps and the hiss of the ancient coffee maker in the corner. Ben and I were the worst off of the lot. As the first on the scene, the ones to find little Sadie Wallace shivering and alone, it was as if we'd been tainted by proximity to the inexplicable. Our colleagues averted their eyes when we passed in the halls, conversations stuttering to an awkward halt when we entered a room. Even the most seasoned rangers, men and women who'd spent decades patrolling the rugged backcountry, seemed to regard us with a mixture of pity and wary unease. As if by bearing witness to the impossible, we'd been somehow fundamentally altered, no longer quite fit for the realm of the rational and the mundane. For my part, I wore my newfound pariah status like a shroud, a grim reminder of the gnawing certainty that had taken root in my gut. I knew, with a bone-deep conviction, that whatever had torn the Wallace family from the trail that day had been no simple wild animal. There was a malevolent intelligence in its methods, a calculating cruelty far removed from the base instincts of any natural predator. And though I had no proof beyond a traumatized child's broken recollections and my own clawing intuition, I knew with grim certainty that the creature would strike again. It was only a matter of time. I threw myself into my work with a desperate, manic energy. If my colleagues sought to avoid me, I made it all the easier for them, volunteering for the longest patrols, the most remote trail maintenance, any assignment that would keep me out in the forest for days at a time. If I was being honest with myself, A part of me burned for a confrontation, ached to come face to face with the nightmare made flesh, as if by meeting it head-on I could somehow excise the dread that had coiled itself around my heart, the insidious whisper in the back of my skull that murmured of dark and ancient things that had no place in the waking world. It was on one of those long, lonely treks that I began to see the signs. The first was subtle, easily dismissed by a less superstitious mind. A tree not far from the Wallaces' abandoned campsite, its trunk gouged with a set of deep, parallel furrows that could only have been made by claws of a startling size. I traced the ragged grooves with a fingertip, my breath catching in my throat as I tried to picture the sheer strength and ferocity it would take to carve such marks in the tough, weathered bark. As I pressed deeper into the wilderness, fully diverged now from the neatly maintained trails with their cheerful signage and tidy gravel paths, the markers grew both more frequent and more unsettling. Here a scattering of broken branches, hanging at odd angles as if snapped by the passage of an immense bulk. There a torn snatch of fabric caught on a thorn bush, the lurid orange of a standard-issue search and rescue jacket. And everywhere, interwoven with the rich, loamy scent of leaf mulch and wildflowers, a strange, musky odor unlike anything I'd ever encountered in all my years of roaming the backcountry. It was a heavy, rank smell, shot through with an unmistakable note of carrion, the reek of a predator's den, a charnel house of decaying flesh and clotted gore. As the shadows lengthened and the light filtering through the overarching canopy of leaves took on a sepulchral blue tinge, I knew with grim certainty that I was on the right track. Or perhaps more accurately that I had finally been deemed worthy prey, the stalker turned stalked in a lethal game of cat and mouse. My grip tightened on my rifle, the worn stock slick with sweat where my palms pressed against the wood. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn back, to flee this oppressive, watching silence, and return to the safe confines of civilization. But I had come too far now, seen too much to ever know true peace again. Whatever awaited me in the gathering dark, I would meet it head-on, and damn the consequences. Night fell with a swiftness that felt almost imperative, as if the forest itself was abetting the creature in its hunt. The narrow corridor of sky, visible through the lacing of branches overhead, faded from indigo to a starless black, leaving only the feeble beam of my flashlight to illuminate the close-pressing trunks and grasping undergrowth. Every rustling leaf, every crack of a twig underfoot, sent jolts of adrenaline surging through my veins. I imagined I could feel the weight of the thing's gaze boring into my back, the prickle of its hot, hungry breath stirring the hairs on my nape. When the attack came, it was almost a relief, a breaking of the unbearable tension that had stretched my nerves to the snapping point. One moment I was picking my way down a half-overgrown game trail, my whole being coiled tight with strain and dread anticipation. The next, an immense dark shape exploded from the brush to my left, a blur of matted fur and yellowed fangs that resolved itself into a nightmarish silhouette as it reared up on its hind legs, towering over me like a monolith of pure, voracious hunger. Time seemed to slow, the rapid thudding of my heartbeat drowning out all other sound as I frantically fumbled my rifle to my shoulder. Some distant, clinical part of my brain, the part not gibbering in blank animal terror, noted the impossible details, the sheer mass of the thing, easily twice the bulk of the largest grizzly, the disturbingly almost human cant of its stance, the glint of saurian intelligence burning in its eyes. It lunged for me in awful silence, no roar or snarl to herald its charge, just the rush of displaced air and the creak of tendons as it brought one massive taloned paw slashing down towards my face. I fired on pure instinct, the shot cracking out with an ear-shattering report that seemed to hang in the air long after the echoes faded. The creature staggered, black ichor spraying from a wound in its chest, but it didn't fall. Instead, it swatted the rifle from my hands with a contemptuous flick of its wrist, sending the weapon pinwheeling off into the darkness. I had a dazed instant to register the splintering crunch as the stock shattered against a trunk somewhere in the gloom. And then the thing was on me, its bulk bearing me to the ground in a crush of dead leaves and snapping vegetation. I fought with the desperate strength of a damned soul, flailing and bucking, my fists connecting with a dense layer of matted fur and ropey muscle that felt more like punching a sheer rock face. Hot, fetid breath gusted against my face as the creature's jaws gaped wide, strings of reeking saliva dripping onto my cheeks and neck. I had a brief vertiginous glimpse straight down the black gullet of its throat, and then pain exploded through my body as its teeth closed on my shoulder, slowly worrying the flesh like a dog with a bone. I must have screamed then, a high animal shriek of agony, but I couldn't hear it over the roaring static that had swallowed my senses. Dimly, through the red fog hazing my vision, I was aware of reaching for my belt, numb fingers scrabbling at the hard plastic sheath of my hunting knife. The creature shook me like a rag doll, its growl a low, leisurely rumble as it savored my futile struggles. My groping hand closed around the knife's hilt, and with a final, desperate surge of effort, I ripped the blade free and plunged it hilt deep into the corded bulk of the thing's neck. The effect was instantaneous. The creature released its grip on my ravaged shoulder, rearing back with a basso howl of rage and pain. I felt the knife wrench free of my grasp, still lodged in the thing's flesh as it staggered upright, black blood sheeting from the wound. For an eternal, horrifying second, I was certain it would lunge for me again, finish the job of tearing me to bloody, staggering to my feet. I clutched at my mangled shoulder, hot blood seeping between my fingers as I backed away from the wounded monstrosity before me. The creature hunched forward, one gnarled paw scrabbling at the knife embedded in its neck, a guttural snarl bubbling from its throat. But even in its pain-racked throes, I could detect a malevolent calculation in the way it tracked my movements, those soulless yellow eyes boring into mine with an almost contemptuous hunger. It knew, as I did, that my desperate blow had only bought me a brief reprieve. In my weakened, wounded state, I stood no chance against the relentless predator should it choose to continue its pursuit. Breath coming in ragged gasps, I cast about wildly for a means of escape, some miraculous path to salvation amidst the close-pressing trees and tangled undergrowth. My rifle was lost, claimed by the forest, and even if I had it, I harbored no illusions that mere bullets would halt the creature's relentless advance. Any second, I expected to feel the devastating swipe of those scythe-like claws across my back, to hear the crunch of fangs piercing my spine in a welter of gore. But as the thudding of my heart marked out the passing seconds and the fatal blow never came, a dull flicker of realization pierced the fog of my pain-addled mind. The creature hadn't moved. It remained crouched in a pool of its own foul ichor, muscles bunched and quivering, but held in check by some invisible tether. As I watched, hardly daring to breathe, it raised its head and loosed a deafening howl into the night sky, the sound reverberating through the forest like the tolling of a funeral bell. And in that moment, as that otherworldly keening set my teeth on edge and raised the hairs on my arms, I understood. The thing wasn't merely wounded, it was calling for backup. Heedless now of the stabbing agony radiating from my savage shoulder, I fled, crashing through the clawing branches and snagging vines in a blind, stumbling rush. Behind me the creature's howls rose in pitch and fervor, a chilling descant that seemed to come from all around, as if the very trees themselves had joined its chorus. Under the music of my ragged breathing and the thrashing of my passage, I fancied I could hear other sounds, the drum of heavy paw falls, the eager huffing of pursuit. The forest blurred around me, my world narrowing to a smear of shadow and twisted trunks, the fickle beam of my flashlight swinging wildly as I ran. Time lost all meaning in that headlong flight, minutes stretching into an eternity of gasping breaths and burning muscles. The roar of my pulse in my ears nearly drowned out the unnatural silence that had swallowed the wood, the conspicuous absence of night birds and insects, as if every living creature had fled before the onslaught of the unnatural. Just as my strength began to falter, my knees threatening to buckle beneath me from sheer exhaustion and loss of blood, the trees abruptly opened up ahead, the anemic light of a waning moon spilling into the clearing to illuminate the silhouette of a small ramshackle structure. The ranger outpost. In my panic, operating on pure animal instinct, my battered body had delivered me to the closest thing these woods could offer to sanctuary. Nearly weeping with relief, I half ran, half fell through the sagging doorway, barring the weathered timber behind me with trembling arms that barely seemed able to lift their own weight. Wedging a rickety chair beneath the knob for good measure, I sank to the dusty floorboards, breath coming in great, shuddering gulps. Ensconced in the comparative safety of those four walls, no matter how meager their protection, The full weight of the horror I'd just witnessed came crashing over me in a nauseating wave. The creature, that lumbering nightmare of fangs and matted fur, had been no accident of nature. No quirk of genetics or spontaneous mutation could account for the malign, calculating intelligence that had blazed in those hellish yellow eyes. No earthly beast could have shrugged off a rifle shot and a 10-inch blade buried to the hilt like mere annoyances. No, the thing that had stalked me through the shadowed glens, that even now prowled the night-shrouded forest beyond these walls, was a wholly unnatural entity, an abomination that walked in blasphemous defiance of every natural law. With shaking hands, I peeled aside the shredded remnants of my shirt to examine the ruin of my shoulder. The wounds were deep and ragged, puckered flesh gleaming obscenely in the guttering flare of the backup generator's emergency lights. Already I could feel the insidious burn of infection setting in, the skin around the gouges flushed an angry, unhealthy red. I needed medical attention, and I needed it soon. But even if I could reach the radio, even if I could summon help to this remote outpost, I knew with grim certainty that no rescue would be forthcoming before dawn. The creature and its foul get had the run of the forest now, and heaven help any poor soul foolhardy enough to come between them and their chosen quarry. Grimacing, I hauled myself to my feet and staggered over to the dented supply locker in the corner. It was sparsely stocked, just a few desiccated ration bars and some basic first aid supplies. But I seized upon the meager offerings like a starving man at a feast. Smearing antiseptic cream over my oozing wounds with a hiss of pain, I bound the injury as tightly as I could with a roll of sterile gauze. It wasn't much, but it would have to suffice. If I lived to see the morning, I'd count myself lucky. At this point, infection was the least of my worries. Rummaging through the rest of the locker's contents, I struck pay dirt in the form of a battered old shotgun and a handful of shells. The weapon was in a sorry state, its barrel pitted with rust and the stock worn smooth by generations of hard use. But it was a lifeline, a last desperate fingerhold on survival. I fed the shells into the breech with a satisfying series of clicks, the heft of the gun in my hands lending a small measure of comfort despite the direness of my circumstances. Outside, the wind had picked up, setting the aging timber of the shack groaning and swaying on its foundations. But beneath the mournful whistle of the gusts, I thought I could detect another sound, low and grating, a wild, gibbering muttering that rose and fell in eerie counterpoint, sometimes almost resolving into what sounded like guttural syllables or percussive grunts. The vocalizations of the pack as they closed in, tightening the noose with patient, implacable purpose. They knew I was here, knew I was wounded and trapped, a rat cowering in its flimsy bolt hole. It was only a matter of time before the hunter became the hunted once more. Grimly I checked the load on the shotgun, the solidity of the weapon an anchor against the black tide of fear threatening to pull me under. The long dark hours until sunrise stretched before me like an impassable abyss, a merciless gauntlet of dread and paranoia. Every dancing shadow thrown by the feeble generator lights morphed into a hulking silhouette. Every errant creak of the roof beams the prowling tread of a predator. I dozed fitfully, propped against the far wall with the shotgun cradled in my lap. My laboring heart, brittle sanity, and that ancient rusting firearm the only fragile bulwark between me and the unhinged nightmares that slavered for my blood just beyond the warped timber walls. I caught my first glimpse of the rising sun through a knothole in the weathered planking, its watery light staining the floorboards a weak, washed-out gray. My first instinct was disbelief, a knee-jerk rejection that I'd made it through that eternal night with my life and faculties intact. The hours leading up to that anemic dawn were little more than a strobe-lit fever dream in my memory, a broken montage of pain and creeping horrors, barely held at bay by the dying sputter of the generator and the cold comfort of a loaded gun. Wincing, I levered myself to my feet, my abused muscles screaming in protest after a night spent huddled on the unyielding boards. My shoulder throbbed mercilessly beneath its swaddling of gauze, the flesh hot and swollen even through the numbing fog of adrenaline and endorphins. Infection had well and truly set in, my body succumbing to the onslaught of whatever foul bacteria had lurked in the creature's maw. If I didn't get real medical attention soon, and a boatload of antibiotics, I'd be facing down more than just external monsters. But remarkably, blessedly, I had survived the night. The gibbering and rustling outside the shack had gradually tapered off with the first signs of approaching light, the unnatural muttering replaced by the hesitant chirping of waking birds. The thing, whatever the hell it was, seemed disinclined to hunt by day. I wasn't naive enough to think it had given up, slunk off to whatever primordial den had disgorged it. But the rising sun had granted me a precious reprieve, a window of opportunity to limp my way back to the false security of civilization. I unbarred the door with slow, pained movements, the shotgun still clutched white-knuckled in one hand. The morning air was crisp and redolent with the loamy scent of pine and thick carpets of sodden leaves. To my bruised and grateful eyes, the forest looked almost ordinary in the light of day, dappled in gold and shadow, rife with the flitting of small songbirds. No sign remained of the lurking horrors that had haunted the night, the abomination that had nearly torn me limb from limb. But if my hellish encounter had left no mark on this primeval landscape, the same could not be said for my battered psyche. I found I couldn't set foot on the narrow, twisting path that led back to the main ranger station without a shudder of dread, my breath coming harsh and labored in my chest. Every snapping twig and swaying branch was imbued with malign potential, dark promises of pain and blood. The once comforting cathedral hush of the deep woods now felt pregnant with dread, watchful and ominous. In the end, it was only through sheer force of will that I placed one foot in front of the other, retracing my frantic flight in a daze of pain and exhaustion. My mind skittered and shied from the grim reckoning that awaited me back at headquarters. How could I even begin to explain what had transpired out here, to put into words the indescribable violation of the natural order I'd witnessed? They'd write me off as a madman, a shattered husk pushed beyond the breaking point by some nameless trauma. At best, my report would be dismissed as the ravings of a man unhinged by his ordeal. At worst, it'd spell the end of my career, perhaps even my freedom. But what other choice did I have? To remain silent, to bury the unspeakable truth like some shameful secret? To let the family and friends of the Wallace clan go on believing their loved ones had fallen victim to a freak animal attack? No, I owed them that cold comfort of the truth, no matter how unpalatable. I owed it to little Sadie Wallace, to the memory of her broken sobs and the paralyzing terror that had haunted her eyes. Most of all, I owed it to myself, to the tattered remnants of my integrity and the ideals that had first driven me to this unforgiving calling. I couldn't run from this, couldn't hide from the evil that lurked in the shadowed fringes of the map. Someone had to take a stand, to bear witness to the horrors that went bump in the primeval night. And if not me, then who? By the time I stumbled into the ranger station, one arm hanging limp and useless at my side, I was running on little more than fumes and raw adrenaline. A small part of me was darkly amused by the looks of poleaxed shock on my colleagues' faces as they took in my haggard, blood-soaked form. No doubt I looked like I'd gone a few rounds with a wood chipper and come out the worse for wear. Ben was the first to unfreeze from his stunned paralysis, hurrying forward to catch me as I swayed on my feet. "Jesus, Jake, what happened? We've been trying to raise you on the radio all night." I barked a laugh, the sound cracked and hollow in my throat. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." And I was right. They didn't believe, not at first. Not even Ben, who'd seen the impossible emptiness left by the Wallace family's abduction, who'd been there to witness the unnatural dread that permeated these woods. I laid it all out in the clipped, precise language of an incident report. The strange spoor that had first caught my attention, the signs of an apex predator marking its territory, the hulking monstrosity that had nearly claimed my life. I offered up the ragged punctures in my own flesh as evidence, held up the spent shotgun shells and crusted residue of the thing's foul ichor, but I could see it in their eyes, the wary skepticism and sidelong glances that said I'd taken a running leap off the edge of reason. An animal attack, yes, maybe even one of startling viciousness. But a demonic entity straight out of a campfire tale? An evolutionary impossibility that moved with cunning intelligence and insatiable hunger? That was beyond the pale, a bridge too far for these staunch pragmatists of the wilderness. Better to write me off as a casualty of trauma, a pitiable wreck pushing fairy tales to avoid confronting the stark reality of his own failure. In the end, I gave my statement to a stone-faced cadre of park officials and local law enforcement, spoke the words I knew would doom any shred of standing or credibility I had left. Then I walked out, my resignation left unsigned on the superintendent's desk. There would be no formal inquest, no queries or commendations. Any official mention of my involvement would be quietly purged from the record, swept under the rug like so much inconvenient dirt. The last known person to set foot in the Voorhees ravine would remain a mystery, an unsolved footnote in the park's history. As for me, I'd fade into obscurity, one more broken soldier in the unending secret war between man and the primal unknown. In the weeks and months that followed, I drifted, a listless ghost cut adrift from all purpose or direction. The wounds healed to knotted scar tissue, but the deeper lacerations, the ones carved into my psyche, remained raw and weeping. Sleep became an elusive specter, my nights haunted by the guttural echoes of inhuman voices, the phantom burn of fetid breath on my face. I took to drink in a futile attempt to drown out the gibbering in my head, to sand the edges off the memories that rose with each descending sun. But no amount of cheap whiskey could scour away the knowledge of the depthless evil that lurked just beyond the firelight, the horrors that stalked the wild places with a hunger that could never be sated. The years ground on in a haze of barstool exile and flophouse squalor. I made my way to the city, figuring the cold comfort of concrete and teeming humanity might keep the nightmares at bay. But the abominations born of that distant ravine had followed me out of the primeval forest, indelible as a brand upon my mind. Every darkened alleyway concealed a waiting predator, every nighttime shadow imbued with the promise of blood and rending teeth. I took to carrying an iron poker for protection, even though I knew how useless such a paltry weapon would be. Some demons can't be outrun, no matter how far or fast you flee. Their teeth are planted in your marrow, their claws forever sunk into the meat of your brain. So here I remain, propping up the end of the bar in this dingy watering hole, spinning tales to any sad sack sober enough to listen. The ravings of a madman, they say, when they think I'm too drunk to hear. Old Jake and his monster stories, his conspiracy theories and dire warnings. I've become a living shrine to a secret truth none dare acknowledge, a walking memento mori in this age of progress and rationality. But I know there are others out there, lonely voices crying in the wilderness, those marked by encounters with the things that should not be, cursed with the knowledge of terrors older than humanity itself. We are scattered and battered, soldiers in a war we never enlisted to fight, but fight we must, even if our only weapon is the conviction of our testimony, the courage to stand as witnesses against the encroaching darkness. Because I have seen the face of the beast that stalks the shadowed edges of our world. I have felt its cruel hunger and malign intelligence, known the white-hot breath of its, because I have seen the face of the beast that stalks the shadowed edges of our world. I have felt its cruel hunger and malign intelligence, known the white-hot breath of its fury on my skin, and I know, with a bone-deep certainty, that the abomination that nearly claimed my life in the depths of the Adirondack wilderness was no mere accident of nature. It was a harbinger, a warning of horrors yet to come. For there are older and fouler things than man lurking in the forgotten corners of our world, primordial malevolences that view our dominion as little more than a momentary irritation. They have slumbered in their hidden places, patiently waiting as millennia ticked by, and civilizations rose and fell like so much flotsam on the tides of history. But they are stirring now, shaking off the dust of eons as our species crowds ever further into the wild and forsaken places. And when they rise, ravenous and pitiless and swollen with the rancid remains of our despoiled planet, all our vaunted science and technology will be as leaves before a hurricane. The frail web of logic and reason we've spun for ourselves will melt like dew beneath the bloated crimson harvest moon, and the true inheritors of the earth will once more hold sway in a kingdom of blood and madness. The old drunk at the end of the bar raises his glass in sardonic salute and downs the dregs in a single convulsive gulp. Believe or disbelieve as you see fit. Take the ramblings of a shattered old man for what you will, but never forget, even for an instant, how precarious our dominion over this earth truly is. For the wild still has teeth, and the deep dark places will always hunger for our demise. When you live in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest, every creak of the wood and rustle of leaves has a story to tell. I should know. I've spent most of my life among these ancient trees, listening to their secrets and bearing witness to the mysteries they hold. My name is Hank Lawson, and for over 30 years I've called this forest my home. My cabin, a humble structure made of logs and memories, sits near a secluded river bend, where the water flows slow and silent, like a secret whispered in the night. It's a simple life, one governed by the rhythms of nature and the changing of the seasons. Out here, the modern world feels like a distant dream, a fading echo drowned out by the song of the wind through the pines. I first came to these woods as a young man, eager to escape the noise and chaos of the city. I'd grown up in Seattle, a child of concrete and asphalt, but something in me had always yearned for the wild places, the untamed corners of the world where man's influence had yet to take hold. So when an opportunity arose to work as a forest ranger in one of the most remote areas of the state, I leapt at the chance. Those early years were a revelation, a baptism into a world I'd only ever glimpsed from afar. I spent my days patrolling the vast expanses of the forest, learning the lay of the land and the ways of the creatures that called it home. At night, I would sit by the fire, listening to the old-timers spin yarns about the history of the region, tales of loggers and homesteaders, of fortunes made and lives lost in the green embrace of the woods. As time passed, I found myself growing more and more attached to this wild and unforgiving landscape. The solitude that had once seemed so daunting became a comfort, a balm to my restless spirit. I came to appreciate the subtle beauty of the forest, the way the light filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with gold, the soft sigh of the wind through the branches, the timeless majesty of the trees that had stood sentinel for centuries. When my time as a ranger came to an end, I knew I could never go back to the city, to the life I had left behind. The forest had claimed me, body and soul, and I had no desire to be anywhere else. And so, with little more than a few hand tools and a dream, I set about building my cabin in a quiet corner of the woods, a place where I could live out my days in harmony with the land. For years, life in the forest was everything I had hoped for. My days were filled with the simple tasks of survival, chopping wood, tending to my small garden, fishing in the clear waters of the river. In the evenings, I would sit on my porch, a cup of coffee in hand, and watch the sun paint the sky in shades of fire as it sank below the horizon. It was a peaceful existence, one that seemed almost untouched by the passage of time. But as the saying goes, all good things must come to an end. And for me, that end began in the summer of 1980, when the shadows in the forest seemed to grow longer and the nights grew heavy with a sense of foreboding that I couldn't quite shake. It was an evening in late July, and the sun was setting later and later, casting long shadows that danced eerily through the woods. I was out chopping wood, a routine task that had become almost meditative over the years. There was something soothing about the rhythmic thwack of the axe against the log, the clean scent of pine, and the distant hoot of an owl as it called out to the gathering dusk. Rufus, my loyal German shepherd, lay nearby, his muzzle resting on his paws as he watched me work. He'd been my constant companion for nearly a decade, a sturdy and fearless presence at my side through all the challenges of forest life. But lately, I'd noticed a change in his demeanor, a restlessness that seemed out of character for the usually unflappable dog. As I split the last log and added it to the growing pile, I paused to wipe the sweat from my brow and take a swig of water from my canteen. That's when I noticed Rufus. He was standing at attention, his ears perked and his body rigid as he stared into the deepening shadows of the tree line. A low growl rumbled in his throat, a sound I'd never heard him make before. "What is it, boy?" I asked, setting down my axe and moving to stand beside him. "You see something out there?" But Rufus didn't respond, didn't even spare me a glance. His gaze remained fixed on the forest, his hackles raised and his teeth bared in a silent snarl. I followed his line of sight, squinting into the gathering darkness, but I could see nothing out of the ordinary, just the familiar tangle of trunks and undergrowth that had been my backdrop for so many years. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. There was a heaviness to the air, a sense of expectation that set my nerves on edge. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild, but the unease lingered, like a splinter buried deep beneath the skin. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences began to mount. It started with small things, easily dismissed, branches snapping in the night, the prickling sensation of being watched as I went about my chores. But as the weeks wore on, the incidents grew more frequent and more unsettling. Rufus's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would pace the perimeter of the clearing, growling at the shadows and refusing to venture into the forest, even when I called him. It was as if he sensed something out there, some threat that my human senses couldn't perceive. Then came the night that changed everything, the night that shattered the peace of my forest idyll and set me on a path I never could have imagined. It was a moonless night, the kind of darkness that seems to swallow the world whole. I was sitting by the fire, nursing a mug of coffee, and trying to shake off the unease that had become my constant companion in recent weeks. Rufus lay at my feet, his eyes glinting in the flickering light of the flames. Suddenly the stillness of the night was shattered by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a scream, a high, piercing wail that seemed to go on forever, echoing through the trees like a banshee's cry. But it wasn't the scream of an animal, not the yowl of a coyote or the shriek of a mountain lion. No, this was a human scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that chilled me to my very core. I was on my feet in an instant, my heart pounding in my chest. Rufus was up too, his ears flattened against his skull and his teeth bared in a snarl. I grabbed my shotgun from its place by the door and clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. "Come on, boy," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to check this out." And with that, we set off into the night, the forest closing in around us like a living thing. Little did I know, as I took those first steps into the darkness, that I was embarking on a journey that would test the very limits of my sanity and force me to confront the darkest corners of the human soul. The scream had come from deep within the forest, near an old, abandoned mine shaft that had been a fixture of the landscape for as long as anyone could remember. The mine had been closed down decades ago, its entrance boarded up and its tunnels left to the mercy of time and the elements. But there were stories about the place, whispered tales of dark deeds and unspeakable horrors that had taken place in its depths. As a ranger, I had always dismissed such stories as mere folklore, the product of overactive imaginations and too many nights spent around the campfire. But now, as Rufus and I made our way through the darkness, the beam of my flashlight barely penetrating the gloom, I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of dread, as if those old tales might hold more truth than I'd ever dared to believe. The forest was eerily quiet as we walked, the only sound the crunching of our footsteps on the leaf-strewn ground, and the occasional snap of a twig under Rufus's paws. The air was thick and heavy, laden with the scent of decay and something else, something that set my teeth on edge and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As we drew closer to the mine, I began to notice signs of recent activity: broken branches, scuffed earth, and the unmistakable imprint of boot treads in the soft soil. It was clear that someone had been here, and recently. But who would venture so deep into the forest, so far from any trail or human habitation? The answer came as we rounded a bend in the path and the entrance to the mine came into view. The boards that had once blocked the entrance had been torn away, splintered wood lying scattered on the ground. And there, in the gaping maw of the tunnel, a flicker of light, the warm glow of a campfire dancing on the rough-hewn walls. Rufus let out a low whine, his body pressed close to my leg as if seeking reassurance. I reached down and gave him a quick pat, my own heart hammering in my chest. Then, taking a deep breath, I stepped forward, my shotgun at the ready. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the oppressive silence. "Is anyone there?" For a moment there was no response, just the echo of my own words bouncing back at me from the depths of the mine. But then, as I took another step forward, I heard it. A soft rustling, the sound of movement from within the tunnel. I tightened my grip on the shotgun, my finger hovering over the trigger. "I'm armed," I said, my voice steady despite the fear that churned in my gut. "Come out slowly with your hands up." Silence. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, a man. his face obscured by a tangle of matted hair and a wild, unkempt beard. He was dressed in filthy, tattered clothing, his skin smeared with grime and what looked like dried blood. In his hand he clutched a knife, the blade glinting dully in the light of my flashlight. "You don't belong here," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "The forest is mine. It speaks to me, tells me to keep it pure." I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Put down the knife," I said, fighting to keep my voice calm. "We can talk about this. I'm here to help." But the man just shook his head, a feverish light in his eyes. "No one can help me," he said. "The forest demands a sacrifice. It must be fed." And with that he lunged forward, the knife slashing through the air. I stumbled back, my finger tightening on the trigger. But before I could fire, Rufus leapt into action. With a snarl, he launched himself at the man, his teeth sinking into the flesh of his arm. The man howled in pain, the knife clattering to the ground as he struggled to free himself from Rufus's grip. I used the distraction to my advantage, closing the distance between us and bringing the butt of my shotgun down on the man's head with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the ground, blood trickling from a gash on his temple. Rufus stood over him, hackles raised, until I called him off. With shaking hands I checked the man's pulse, relief washing over me as I felt the steady thrum beneath my fingers. It was only then, as the adrenaline began to fade, that I noticed the campsite tucked away in a corner of the mine shaft. There was a small fire burning, its flickering light illuminating a scattering of personal effects: a backpack, a sleeping bag, a few cans of food, and there, huddled against the far wall, a figure, small and still. My heart in my throat, I approached, the beam of my flashlight falling on a young woman, her eyes wide and filled with terror. She was filthy, her clothes torn and her skin marred with bruises and cuts. But she was alive, and as I knelt beside her, she reached out and clutched at my arm with a desperate strength. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "help me." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. I managed to get the young woman, who introduced herself as Emily, back to my cabin, where I tended to her wounds and made her as comfortable as I could. She was in rough shape, dehydrated and malnourished, her body bearing the marks of her ordeal. But she was alive, and for that I was grateful. As for the man from the mine, I had bound his hands and feet and left him under Rufus's watchful eye, while I hiked out to the nearest ranger station to report what had happened. It was a long, arduous trek, made all the more difficult by the weight of the last few hours pressing down on me. By the time I reached the station, I was exhausted, my mind reeling with questions and doubts. The rangers listened to my story with a mixture of shock and disbelief, their faces growing grimmer as I recounted the details of the man's attack and Emily's rescue. They assured me that they would handle the situation from here, that I had done the right thing by coming to them. But as I made my way back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the dark secrets of the forest were just starting to unravel. Over the next few days, as Emily began to regain her strength, she told me her story. She had been hiking alone, she said, a solo trek through the wilderness to clear her head and find some peace after a difficult year. She had been setting up camp when the man had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, his eyes wild and his knife glinting in the fading light. He had taken her by surprise, overpowering her easily and dragging her deep into the forest, to the abandoned mine where he had made his lair. There he had kept her prisoner, ranting about the voices in his head and the sacrifices demanded by the forest. As I listened to her story, a chill ran down my spine. I had heard tales of the old mine, of course, whispered legends of dark rituals and unspeakable acts carried out in its depths. But I'd always dismissed them as mere stories, the product of overactive imaginations and too much time spent in the isolation of the woods. Now, though, I couldn't help but wonder if there might be some truth to those old tales. The man's ravings about the forest, his talk of sacrifices and dark demands, it all seemed to point to something deeper, something that went beyond the actions of a lone, disturbed individual. I shared my concerns with Emily, and to my surprise, she nodded in agreement. She had heard the man's rantings, she said, had listened to his feverish mutterings as he paced the confines of the mine, and she had come to believe that there was something out there, something ancient and malevolent that called to him, that drove him to commit the unspeakable acts. Together we pored over the man's belongings, the few meager possessions he had left behind in the mine. Among them, we found a battered journal, its pages filled with cramped, frenzied writing that spoke of dark visions and whispered commands from the depths of the forest. As we read through the journal, a picture began to emerge of a man slowly losing his grip on reality, consumed by a belief in a dark power lurking in the heart of the woods. He wrote of a presence that watched him from the shadows, a force that demanded blood and sacrifice in exchange for its favor. The more we read, the more convinced I became that there was something truly evil at work in the forest, something that went beyond the ravings of a madman. And I knew that I couldn't rest until I had uncovered the truth, no matter where it might lead me. In the days that followed, I threw myself into the investigation, determined to unravel the mystery of the dark presence in the woods. I spent long hours combing through old records and newspaper archives, searching for any mention of strange occurrences or unsolved disappearances in the area. What I found was a chilling tapestry of darkness stretching back decades, a history of vanishings and unexplained events that had been all but forgotten by the outside world. There were stories of hikers who had ventured into the woods and never returned, of strange lights and eerie sounds emanating from the depths of the forest. And always at the center of it all, the abandoned mine, like a dark heart pulsing with malevolent energy. The more I dug, the more convinced I became that the mine was the key to the mystery, that whatever evil lurked in the forest had its roots in that ancient forsaken place. Emily, too, was haunted by the unanswered questions, the lingering shadows of her ordeal. She had returned to the city to try to pick up the pieces of her life, but I could see in her eyes that she would never be truly free of the forest's grip. Not until the truth was. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, I knew that I had to confront the darkness head-on. I couldn't let the evil that lurked in the forest continue to claim innocent lives, to spread its malevolent influence unchecked. I gathered my courage and my gear and set out for the mine, determined to put an end to the nightmare once and for all. Rufus, ever loyal, walked by my side, his presence a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. The journey through the woods was a test of nerves, every shadow and rustling leaf a potential threat. But I pressed on, driven by a grim determination to see this through to the end. When I reached the mine, I found it much as I had left it, the entrance gaping like a wound in the earth. But there was a palpable sense of malice emanating from its depths, a cold, creeping dread that seemed to seep into my very bones. I descended into the darkness, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The air grew thick and heavy, the stench of decay and something else, something ancient and foul, filling my nostrils. As I made my way deeper into the mine, I began to hear whispers, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from every direction at once, a cacophony of hissing voices that clawed at the edges of my sanity. "Leave this place," they whispered. "You do not belong here." But I pressed on, gritting my teeth against the rising tide of fear. I knew that I was close to the source of the evil, that the heart of the darkness lay just ahead, and then I saw it, a pulsing mass of shadow and malice, a swirling vortex of pure, unbridled evil. It seemed to fill the entire chamber, a living, breathing thing that radiated a cold, hungry intelligence. I raised my weapon, my hands shaking as I took aim at the heart of the darkness, but before I could pull the trigger, a figure emerged from the shadows, the man from the mine, his eyes blazing with a feverish light. "You cannot destroy it," he hissed. "It is eternal, undying. It will consume you, as it has consumed me." But I wasn't listening. With a roar of defiance, I opened fire, emptying my gun into the writhing mass of shadows. Rufus lunged forward, his teeth bared in a snarl as he tore at the inky tendrils that lashed out at us. For a moment it seemed as if the darkness would overwhelm us, that we would be swallowed whole by the malevolent force that had haunted the forest for so long. But then, with a final ear-splitting shriek, the entity began to dissipate, shredding apart like mist in the sunlight. As the last wisps of shadow faded away, I sank to my knees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Rufus limped over to me, his muzzle flecked with black ichor, and I buried my face in his fur, tears of relief and exhaustion streaming down my face. It was over. The evil that had plagued the forest was gone, banished back to the dark corners of the world from whence it came. But as I made my way out of the mine, supporting the broken, sobbing form of the man who had been its thrall, I knew that the scars it had left behind would linger for a long time to come. Years have passed since that fateful day in the mine, but the memories of what I faced there have never faded. I still wake in the night sometimes, my heart pounding and my skin slick with sweat, the echoes of those whispering voices ringing in my ears. But I take comfort in the knowledge that the forest is free now, that the evil that once lurked in its depths has been banished forever. Emily and I keep in touch, bound by the shared trauma of our experience, and I know that she too has found a measure of peace in the years since. As for me, I still live in my cabin by the river, watching the seasons change and the forest grow and thrive around me. Rufus is gone now, his time on this earth spent, but his memory lives on in the quiet moments, in the rustling of the leaves and the murmur of the water over the rocks. And sometimes, when the sun is setting and the shadows are long, I fancy that I can hear his bark echoing through the trees, a reminder of the bond we shared and the battles we fought together. For in the end, that is the true legacy of the forest, not the darkness and the fear, but the strength and the resilience of the human spirit, the unbreakable ties that bind us to one another and to the wild, untamed places of the world. And as long as those bonds endure, as long as there are those who are willing to stand against the darkness, no evil can ever truly prevail.